Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe. Your support is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. The first time I stepped onto the set of The Conjuring, I could feel the weight of something heavy hanging in the air. It wasn't just nerves or anticipation for the film we were about to make. There was something else, something dark, like a cloud lingering just beyond the horizon, waiting to roll in and envelop everything in its path. We were recreating a story based on real events, a haunting so sinister that it left an imprint on anyone who came close to it. But none of us on the set could have anticipated just how real that haunting would feel. My role as a production assistant meant I was everywhere on the set, running errands, setting up scenes, making sure everything was in place before the cameras rolled. I had heard the stories the Perrin family's encounters with malevolent spirits, the real-life Ed and Lorraine Warren, who had tried to help them, but I never imagined I would experience anything like that myself. We were filming at a location outside of Wilmington, North Carolina, a creaky old farmhouse that had been chosen for its resemblance to the original Perrin house. The moment I arrived on set, I felt a chill run down my spine. The farmhouse stood alone, isolated in a clearing surrounded by thick woods, its weathered boards and sagging roof giving it an air of abandonment. The structure seemed to groan in the wind, as if it were alive, breathing and watching. It wasn't long before the strange occurrences began. At first, it was small things, lights flickering for no reason, equipment malfunctioning without explanation. We tried to laugh it off as just the quirks of an old house, but it quickly became apparent that something else was at play. One evening, after a long day of shooting, I stayed behind to help pack up some of the equipment. The sun had already set, and the farmhouse was bathed in the dim glow of our work lights. I was in the main room organizing cables when I heard a door creak open behind me. Thinking it was one of the crew members, I called out, but no one answered. I turned around to see the door slowly swinging open, even though I knew for a fact that it had been locked just moments before. A cold draft swept through the room, sending shivers down my spine. I walked over to the door, intending to close it, but as I reached for the handle, it slammed shut with such force that the entire frame rattled. I jumped back, my heart racing. The room suddenly felt stifling, the air thick and heavy. It was as if the house itself had come alive, and it didn't want me there. I backed away slowly, my breath quickening, and as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. Standing in the doorway to the next room was a figure, its outline barely visible in the dim light. At first I thought it was a trick of the shadows, but then it moved slowly, deliberately, like it was watching me. I froze, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was tall, its form draped in darkness, but its eyes glowed faintly, like to pinpricks of light in the void. I blinked, and in that brief moment, it was gone. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the cables I had been organizing. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cool night air hitting me like a wave of relief. I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me after a long day of work, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The next day on set, I overheard some of the crew members talking about strange things that had been happening. One of the camera operators had felt someone tap him on the shoulder while he was filming, only to turn around and find no one there. The lead actress, Vera Farmiga, had woken up one morning to find 3 long, jagged scratches down the side of her thigh, scratches she couldn't explain. It seemed like everyone had their own story, their own encounter with something they couldn't explain, but no one wanted to talk about it too much. We were all afraid that acknowledging would make it worse. As filming continued, the occurrences grew more frequent, more intense. Doors would open and close on their own, disembodied voices would echo through the halls, and strange shadows would dart across the walls, always just out of sight. One night, while shooting a particularly intense scene in the basement of the farmhouse, the temperature in the room plummeted to freezing in a matter of seconds. Our breath hung in the air in visible puffs, and the actors began to shiver uncontrollably, their teeth chattering as they tried to deliver their lines. We checked the thermostat, but it was set to a comfortable 72 degrees. No one could explain the sudden drop in temperature, but we all felt it an oppressive, bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into our very souls. That same night I had another encounter. I was standing just outside the basement, watching the scene unfold on the monitor, when I felt a hand brush against the back of my neck. I turned around quickly, expecting to see one of the crew members behind me, but there was no one there. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I could feel the goosebumps rise on my skin. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to shake off the sensation, when I heard a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere deep within the house. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a jolt of fear through me unlike anything I had ever experienced. I looked around, but everyone else seemed focused on the scene in front of them, oblivious to the sound I had just heard. I wanted to say something, to tell someone what I had experienced, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if the house had taken hold of me, silencing me with its dark presence. The growl came again, louder this time, and I knew I had to get out of there. I excused myself from the set, telling the director I wasn't feeling well, and hurried outside. The cold night air hit me like a wave, and I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. But the feeling of dread lingered, clinging to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. The final straw came a few days later. We were shooting the film's climactic scene, where the family confronts the malevolent spirit that has been tormenting them. The energy on set was tense, the actors fully immersed in their roles, the crew working tirelessly to bring the scene to life. But as the cameras rolled, something strange began to happen. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. The camera equipment began to malfunction, the images on the monitors distorting and glitching. And then, without warning, one of the lights exploded, sending shards of glass raining down onto the set. The actors screamed, ducking for cover, as the rest of the crew scrambled to shut everything down. In the chaos, I saw it again, the figure from before, standing at the edge of the set, watching. It was only there for a moment, but it felt like an eternity. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and I could feel its gaze boring into me, like it was feeding off my fear. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The lights stabilized, the equipment stopped malfunctioning, and the set returned to a semblance of normalcy. But the damage had been done. We were all shaken, our nerves frayed to the breaking point. No one could explain what had happened, but we all knew something was on that set with us, something that didn't belong. We finished filming a few days later, but the experiences stayed with us long after we had left the farmhouse behind. I tried to forget what had happened, to push the memories of the strange occurrences to the back of my mind, but they lingered like a dark cloud, always just out of reach. Every now and then I would catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye's shadow that didn't belong, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the light, and I would remember. The haunting of the Conjuring set wasn't just a story. It was real, and it left an indelible mark on all of us. To this day, I can't watch The Conjuring without feeling a chill run down my spine. It's more than just a movie, it's a reminder of the darkness that lingers just beyond the veil of our reality, waiting for the right moment to reach through and touch us. And for those of us who were there, that darkness is something we will never be able to escape. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a break from the constant pressure of work and the endless demands of city life. My friends and I had been planning it for weeks, a trip to a remote cabin in the woods, far away from the hustle and bustle of our daily routines. There were 5 of us in total: Sarah, Mike, Jenny, Tom, and me. We'd known each other since college and had been through a lot together, but this weekend was supposed to be different, a chance to reconnect, to unwind, to forget about our problems for a few days. The cabin was located deep in the Adirondacks, miles away from the nearest town. We rented it online, lured in by the pictures of a cozy, rustic retreat nestled among the trees. It looked perfect, exactly what we needed. The drive up there was long and winding, the road getting narrower and more treacherous the further we went. By the time we arrived, it was late afternoon, the sun already starting to dip behind the mountains. The cabin itself was just as picturesque as the photos had promised. A small 2-story structure made of dark wood, with a stone chimney and a porch that wrapped around the front. The air was crisp and clean, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It was idyllic, almost too good to be true. We unloaded the car, bringing in our bags, food, and enough alcohol to last the weekend. Everyone was in high spirits, excited to finally be away from everything. We joked, laughed, and settled in, planning to spend the evening around the fire, telling stories and catching up. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and we gathered in the living room, lighting a fire in the stone hearth. The flames crackled, casting a warm, flickering light over the room. We sat in a circle, drinks in hand, ready to relax and enjoy the night. Mike, always the one to stir things up, suggested we play a game. "How about truth or dare?" he said with a mischievous grin. "Come on, we haven't played that since college." We all groaned, but there was a sense of nostalgia that made it hard to resist. We agreed, and the game began. It started off light, with silly dares and harmless truths. But as the night wore on, the alcohol flowed more freely, and the questions became bolder, the dares riskier. By the time it was my turn, the atmosphere had shifted. There was an edge to the game now, a tension that hadn't been there before. "Truth or dare?" Mike asked, leaning forward, his eyes glinting in the firelight. I hesitated, feeling the weight of the question. Something in the back of my mind told me to choose truth, to play it safe. But the alcohol had loosened my inhibitions, and I didn't want to back down. "Dare," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Mike's grin widened, and for a moment I regretted my decision. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice as if he were about to share a secret. "I dare you to go into the woods and stay there for an hour, alone, no phone, no flashlight, just you and the dark." The room fell silent, the challenge hanging in the air like a cloud of smoke. Everyone looked at me, waiting for my reaction. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. The idea of wandering into the woods at night, with nothing but the darkness and whatever else was out there, sent a shiver down my spine. But I didn't want to be the one to back out, the one to break the game. "Fine," I said, standing up, trying to ignore the knot of fear in my stomach. "I'll do it." Tom handed me his watch, setting the timer for an hour. "We'll be here when you get back," he said, his tone half joking, half serious. The others wished me luck, their faces a mix of encouragement and apprehension. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead, and walked out the door. The cold hit me as soon as I stepped outside, the chill seeping through my jacket and into my bones. The woods were dark, the trees towering above me, their branches intertwining to block out the moonlight. I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me, the path leading away from the cabin quickly swallowed by the shadows. I hesitated, glancing back at the cabin, the warm light from the windows, comforting glow in the darkness. But I couldn't turn back now. I had accepted the dare, and I had to see it through. I took a few tentative steps into the woods, the crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound in the silence. The further I went, the darker it became, the trees closing in around me like a cage. My heart was pounding, the fear I had tried to suppress now clawing its way to the surface. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent my imagination into overdrive, conjuring images of wild animals, or worse, lurking in the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, I found a small clearing and decided to wait there. I sat down on a fallen log, trying to keep my breathing steady while scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one dragging out longer than the last. My mind began to play tricks on me, the shadows shifting, taking on shapes that weren't really there. I could have sworn I saw something move between the trees, a dark figure watching me from the edge of the clearing. But every time I looked directly at it, it disappeared, melting back into the darkness. The temperature continued to drop, the cold seeping into my skin, making my teeth chatter. I rubbed my hands together, trying to generate some warmth. But it was no use. The cold wasn't just physical. It was like a presence, something alive, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I started counting down the minutes, desperate for the hour to be over, to go back to the cabin and forget this ever happened. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere behind me. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I turned slowly, my eyes wide, trying to locate the source of the sound. The growl came again, closer this time, vibrating through the air. My blood ran cold as I realized it wasn't an animal. It was something else, something that shouldn't be out here in the woods. I stood up, my legs trembling, ready to run. But where would I go? The cabin was too far, and I didn't know the woods well enough to find my way back in the dark. The growl came again, louder, more menacing, and I knew I had to move, had to do something. I took a step backward, my foot catching on a root, nearly sending me sprawling. I caught myself just in time, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes watching me from the darkness, filled with a malevolent intelligence. The growling grew louder, more aggressive, as the creature began to move toward me, its form still hidden by the shadows. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel its presence, a primal, predatory energy that made my skin crawl. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran as fast as I could, crashing through the underbrush, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care, as long as it was away from that thing. The trees blurred around me, the branches tearing at my clothes. But I didn't stop. I could hear it behind me, the sound of something big crashing through the woods, getting closer and closer. My lungs were burning, my legs screaming in protest. But I couldn't stop, not with that thing on my heels. I didn't dare look back, didn't want to see how close it was. I just kept running, praying that I would find the cabin, that I would make it out of these woods alive. But the further I ran, the more disoriented I became, the trees all looking the same, the darkness closing in around me. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw a light up ahead. It was faint, barely visible through the trees, but it was enough to give me hope. I pushed myself harder, sprinting toward the light, my legs threatening to give out with every step. The growling was right behind me now, so close that I could feel the hot breath on the back of my neck. I burst into the clearing, the light growing brighter until I realized it wasn't the cabin at all. It was a fire, a small, flickering flame surrounded by stones. With no one around, I skidded to a stop, my chest heaving, my mind racing. What was this? Who had made this fire? And where were they? I didn't have time to think. The growling was still behind me, and I knew I couldn't stay here. But just as I was about to take off again, I heard a voice, a low, whispering voice, coming from the direction of the fire. "Stay," it said, barely audible over the crackling of the flames. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but something held me in place. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Stay, and it won't follow you." My heart was racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. But the growling was getting closer, and I didn't have a choice. I stepped toward the fire, feeling the warmth wash over me, and for a moment the fear subsided. Then, as quickly as it had started, the growling stopped. The woods fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the pounding of my heart. I looked around, expecting to see the creature emerge from the trees, but there was nothing, just the fire and the darkness beyond it. I didn't know what to do, didn't know if I should stay or try to make it back to the cabin. But the voice had told me to stay, and something deep inside me told me to listen. I sat down by the fire, my body trembling, my mind racing. I didn't know how long I stayed there, minutes, hours, but the fear never left me. I kept expecting the creature to return, to lunge at me from the shadows, but it never did. The fire burned steadily, its warmth keeping the cold at bay, its light pushing back the darkness. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep, haunted by nightmares of glowing eyes and growling beasts. When I woke up, the fire was out, the sun just starting to rise. The woods were quiet, peaceful, as if nothing had happened. I stood up, my body aching, and looked around. There was no sign of the creature, no sign of the fire, just the empty clearing and the silence of the early morning. I started walking, hoping to find my way back to the cabin, praying that my friends were still there, that they hadn't come looking for me. It took me hours, but eventually I found the path and made my way back to the cabin. My friends were waiting for me, worried, sick, but relieved to see me. They asked me what had happened, where I had been, but I didn't know what to tell them. I couldn't explain the creature, the fire, the voice. All I knew was that something in those woods wasn't right, something that had been waiting for us, watching us. We packed up and left that morning, cutting the trip short. None of us wanted to stay another night in that cabin, not after what had happened. As we drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the trees, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. I haven't been back to the wood since that night, and I don't plan to. Some things are better left unexplored. Some dares better left unaccepted, because sometimes the things that lurk in the dark are all too real, and sometimes they're just waiting for you to make a mistake. It started as a local legend, a story passed down through generations in our small town. The tale of the haunted bridge was one everyone knew, but few believed. They said that late at night, if you were unlucky enough to cross it alone, you'd hear footsteps behind you, growing louder with each step, even though no one was there. They said that those who heard the footsteps wouldn't make it across the bridge before something terrible happened. But that was just a story, right? A tale to scare children and keep teenagers from staying out too late. At least that's what I thought until it happened to me. I was 17 at the time, a senior in high school, and, like most kids my age, I didn't believe in ghost stories. My friends and I had heard the tales 100 times, and we'd even joked about it, daring each other to cross the bridge alone. But no one ever did. It was all in good fun, something to laugh about on the way home from school. That was until one night when I found myself on the bridge, alone, and the laughter died in my throat. It was late October, a Friday night, and I had stayed out later than I should have. My parents were out of town, and I had been at a friend's house, watching movies and talking about everything from college plans to our favorite bands. I lost track of time, and before I knew it, it was well past midnight. My friend offered to drive me home, but I lived just a few blocks away, and I figured the walk would do me good. I said my goodbyes and headed out into the cool autumn night, the streets quiet, the air crisp and filled with the scent of fallen leaves. The walk home took me across the old stone bridge that spanned the narrow river at the edge of town. The bridge was ancient, built in the early 1800s, and it looked every bit its age. The stones were weathered and cracked, the railings rusted, the whole structure creaking ominously in the wind. But it was the quickest way home, and I had crossed it 1,000 times before without incident. So I wasn't worried. I shoved my hands into my pockets, pulled my jacket tighter around me, and started across. The night was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of gravel under my boots as I walked. I could see my breath in the air, small puffs of mist that quickly dissipated in the cold. The moon was nearly full, casting a pale light over the landscape, and for a moment everything seemed peaceful. But as I reached the midpoint of the bridge, something changed. The air grew colder, the silence heavier, and a sense of unease settled over me, prickling the hairs on the back of my neck. I quickened my pace, eager to get off the bridge and back to the warmth of my home. But as I did, I heard it a soft, almost imperceptible sound at first, like the whisper of wind through the trees. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, just my imagination. But then the sound grew louder, more distinct. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing against the stone of the bridge. Coming from behind me, I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath caught in my throat. The footsteps continued, steady, relentless, getting closer with each passing second. I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance over my shoulder, but there was no one there. The bridge was empty, just me and the darkness, but the footsteps didn't stop. They kept coming, closer and closer. Panic surged through me, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts at once. I wanted to run, to get off that bridge as fast as I could, but my legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. The footsteps were right behind me now, so close I could almost feel the presence of someone or something standing just inches away. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, crushing, filled with a sense of dread so intense it was suffocating. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, too afraid to move, too terrified to turn around. And then I heard it, a voice, low and whispery, right in my ear. "Don't turn around," it said, barely more than a breath, but filled with a menace that sent shivers down my spine. "Whatever you do, don't turn around." I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to get away from that voice, but I was paralyzed, trapped by fear. Somehow I found the strength to move, to take one shaky step forward, then another, my eyes fixed on the end of the bridge. the safety of the street lights just beyond. The voice was still there, whispering in my ear, urging me to turn around to look. But I didn't, I couldn't. I forced myself to keep walking, each step a battle against the terror that threatened to overwhelm me. And then, finally, I was off the bridge, the solid ground of the road beneath my feet. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran all the way home, my heart pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I burst through the front door, slammed it shut behind me, and collapsed against it, my whole body shaking. It took me a long time to calm down, to convince myself that I was safe, that whatever had been on that bridge hadn't followed me. But the fear never really went away. Even now, years later, I can still hear the footsteps, still feel the cold breath on my neck, still hear the voice whispering in my ear. I never crossed that bridge again. I took the long way around, even if it added 20 minutes to my walk. I never told anyone what happened that night, not even my friends. They would have laughed, called me crazy, said it was just my imagination. But I know what I heard, what I felt, and I know that I was lucky to get off that bridge alive. Because some people don't. Some people turn around, and they never come back. It was late, past midnight, when I heard the nose. It wasn't loud, just a faint scraping sound that seemed to come from somewhere downstairs. At first I thought I was imagining it, just the creaks and groans of the old house settling in for the night. But then it came again, sharper this time, followed by a soft thud. My heart started to race. I sat up in bed, straining to hear anything else. The house was silent now, but the adrenaline was already pumping through my veins. I grabbed my phone, checking the time, 12:37 a.m., too late for anyone to be dropping by unannounced, and too early for the sounds to be anything other than trouble. I debated whether or not to investigate. I lived alone, and the thought of creeping around the house in the dark wasn't exactly appealing, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep until I was sure everything was fine. I quietly slipped out of bed, grabbing the baseball bat I kept by the knit-stand. It was an old habit, something I'd picked up after a string of break-ins in the neighborhood last year. I moved cautiously down the hallway, trying to keep my footsteps light on the creaky floorboards. The house felt different, like the air was thicker somehow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that there was someone or something waiting for me just out of sight. When I reached the top of the stairs, I paused, listening again. The house was still, but I could sense something was off. The shadows seemed deeper, more oppressive. I gripped the bat tighter, taking a deep breath before descending the stairs. The living room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but then I noticed the front door. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible between the door and the frame. I knew I had locked it before going to bed. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. I approached the door slowly, peering through the crack. There was nothing outside, just the empty street. But as I reached out to close it, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was that same feeling you get when you know someone is watching you. I spun around, bat raised, but the living room was empty. I closed the door, locking it securely before turning on the lights. The sudden brightness was jarring, making the shadows dance for a moment before settling into their proper places. I stood there, bat in hand, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe it was just a draft, I told myself. Maybe the lock hadn't caught properly, but deep down I knew that wasn't the case. Something had opened that door. I checked the rest of the house, room by room, turning on every light as I went. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone had been inside, But the feeling of being watched persisted, a nagging sensation. At the back of my mind, I eventually made my way back to the living room, settling onto the couch, with the bat still in my lap. I couldn't bring myself to go back upstairs, not until I was sure that whatever had happened was over. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, each second stretching out into an eternity. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sun was streaming through the windows, chasing away the shadows that had seemed so menacing just hours before. I felt a bit foolish in the daylight, my fear for the night before now seeming irrational. But the memory of that open door, of the oppressive feeling in the house, wouldn't leave me. I spent the day going over every inch of the house, looking for anything out of place. There was nothing, no footprints, no disturbed furniture, nothing to suggest that anyone had been there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone. That night, I made sure the door was locked, double-checked it, even. I left a few lights on this time, hoping it would make me feel more secure. But when I finally went to bed, I couldn't sleep. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for that sound again. It didn't take long. The scraping, the soft thud, it was all there, just like the night before. My heart pounded as I listened, waiting for it to stop, for the door to creak open again. But this time there was something different. A low, almost imperceptible breathing, coming from somewhere in the house. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The sound was faint, but it was there, steady, rhythmic. I wanted to get up, to grab the bat and confront whatever it was, but my body wouldn't move. I just lay there, paralyzed by fear, as the breathing grew louder, closer. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The house was silent again, but the sense of dread hung heavy in the air. I didn't sleep at all that night, too afraid to even close my eyes. The next morning, I called the police. I didn't have much to tell them, just that I thought someone had been in my house. They sent a couple of officers over to check the place out, but they didn't find anything. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone being there. They chalked it up to nerves, maybe a bad dream. But I knew better. The next few nights were the same. The sounds, the breathing, the overwhelming sense of being watched. I was barely sleeping, my nerves stretched to the breaking point. I started to dread the nights, knowing that as soon as the sun went down, the terror would begin again. I even considered selling the house, moving somewhere else to get away from whatever was haunting me. But something kept me there, some stubborn need to prove that I wasn't losing my mind. I set up cameras around the house, hoping to catch whatever it was on film, to have proof that I wasn't imagining things. The cameras didn't show anything unusual during the day, just the normal comings and goings. But at night, when the sounds started, the footage was distorted, full of static and strange noises. I couldn't make out anything clearly, just vague shapes and shadows that seemed to move on their own. It was driving me crazy. I was exhausted, on edge, waiting for something to happen, something worse than just the noises. And then, one night, it did. I was lying in bed, the bat still within reach, when I heard it a creak on the stairs, followed by a low, guttural growl. My blood ran cold. I grabbed the bat, my hands shaking as I slowly got out of bed. The growl came again, closer this time, and I could hear the sound of something heavy moving up the stairs. I knew I had to face it, whatever it was. I couldn't keep living like this, in constant fear. I stepped out into the hallway, bat raised, ready to swing at the first sign of movement. But the hallway was empty. I could hear the breathing again, louder now, almost right next to me. I turned slowly, expecting to see something horrible. But there was nothing there, just empty air. I backed up against the wall, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. And then I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I screamed, swinging the bat wildly, but it went right through the air. The breathing stopped, the hallway silent once more. I stood there, panting, bat in hand, waiting for something else to happen. But it was over. Whatever it was had gone. The police came again the next morning. But I didn't tell them everything. They already thought I was losing it. I just said I'd heard someone in the house, that I'd seen a shadow. They did another search, found nothing, and left me with a warning to call if anything else happened. I knew I couldn't stay in the house any longer. Whatever was happening, it wasn't going to stop. I packed a bag and left that same day, moving in with a friend until I could figure out what to do. I never went back to the house. I sold it a few months later, losing money on the sale, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be rid of it. To this day, I don't know what was in that house. Maybe it was all in my head, the stress of living alone in an old place. But I can still hear those sounds in my nightmares, the scraping, the breathing, the growl that shouldn't have been there. And I'll never forget the feeling of that cold hand on my shoulder, the terror that came with it. It was meant to be a simple stopover on our road trip, a chance to rest before continuing our journey across the state. We had been driving for hours, and the fatigue was starting to set in. The small town we found ourselves in was picturesque, almost charming in its old-fashioned way, with its historic buildings and quiet streets. We pulled into the parking lot of the only hotel in town, a grand old building with ivy creeping up its stone walls and an old-fashioned sign that read the Majestic Inn. The hotel had a certain faded elegance about it, the kind you see in old movies. It was clearly once a luxurious establishment, but now it had an air of neglect, with peeling paint and dusty chandeliers. Despite its worn appearance, the lobby was inviting, with a warm glow from the old-fashioned lamps and a roaring fire in the fireplace. The desk clerk, an elderly woman with a kind smile, greeted us warmly and handed us our keys. We were assigned room 314, located on the third floor. The elevator creaked and groaned as it carried us up, and the hallway was dimly lit, with old-fashioned wallpaper peeling at the edges. Our room was spacious, with high ceilings and antique furniture that had seen better days. The bed was large and inviting, and after a long day of driving, we were more than ready to crash. The first night passed without incident. We slept soundly, lulled by the quiet of the hotel and the comfort of the bed. But on the second night, things took a turn for the strange. We were woken in the middle of the night by a soft whispering sound, like someone speaking just out of earshot. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, echoing off the walls and filling the room with an unsettling energy. I shook my partner awake, and we both sat up in bed, straining to hear the whispers. They were indistinguishable, just murmurs and murmurs, but the sense of dread was palpable. We tried to convince ourselves it was just the building settling, old pipes creaking, but the whispers continued, growing more urgent, more frantic. We decided to investigate, so we got out of bed and opened the door to the hallway. The hallway was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the air conditioning. We walked to the end of the hall, but there was no one there, no sign of anyone else. The whispers had stopped, leaving only an oppressive silence in their wake. We went back to our room, but sleep was elusive. We lay awake, listening for any sign of the strange sounds, but the night passed without further incident. The next day, we mentioned the whispers to the desk clerk, hoping she could offer some explanation. Her face paled slightly, and she glanced nervously at the old wall clock. "You're not the first to hear them," she said quietly. "There have been reports of strange occurrences in that room, especially at night. Some say the hotel is haunted by former guests. Those who never checked out. You should be careful." Her words sent a chill down our spines, but we brushed it off, thinking it was just a story to add a touch of intrigue to the old hotel. We decided to stay another night, thinking that the odd occurrence was just a fluke. But as night fell, the atmosphere in the hotel seemed to change. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and shift, taking on strange shapes. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before. They seemed to come from inside the room, swirling around us like a living presence. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, forming shapes that twisted and writhed in the dim light. We could see figures moving just at the edge of our vision, fleeting glimpses of something that didn't belong. The fear was overwhelming, and we huddled together in bed, too terrified to move, too frightened to even call for help. The whispers grew louder, more chaotic, as if a multitude of voices were trying to communicate something. The room felt like it was closing in on us, the shadows growing darker, the whispers more frantic. At one point, we saw a dark figure standing in the corner of the room, its form indistinct, but its presence undeniable. It seemed to be watching us, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. We were paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to speak. The figure slowly advanced towards us, its footsteps silent, but its presence suffocating. Just when it seemed like the terror would never end, the figure vanished, and the whispers stopped abruptly. The room fell silent, the shadows retreating back into the corners. We didn't wait for dawn. We packed our things quickly, our hands shaking as we gathered our belongings. We left the hotel in the dead of night, the sense of relief almost as overwhelming as the fear we had felt. As we drove away, we couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something terrible. The hotel receded into the distance, its dark windows staring back at us as we left. We never spoke of the experience again, but the memory of the whispers and the shadowy figure stayed with us, a haunting reminder of the night we spent in the cursed room of the Majestic Inn. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just a small group of friends looking to escape the city for a few days. We'd rented a cabin in the Blackwood Forest, a remote area known for its dense woods and clear, star-filled skies. It was a place to disconnect, to leave behind the noise and stress of our everyday lives. But none of us were prepared for what we would encounter. The first day was perfect. We arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was setting. The cabin was rustic, but comfortable, nestled deep within the trees, far from any other sign of civilization. We spent the evening around the fire pit, roasting marshmallows and swapping stories. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. As night fell, the forest seemed to come alive with the sounds of nature. Crickets chirped and owls hooted in the distance. It was peaceful, almost lulling us into a false sense of security. We joked about the local legends, tales of strange creatures and haunted woods, but none of us took them seriously. It was just part of the charm, we thought, until the first howl pierced the night. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to echo through the trees, sending a shiver down my spine. We all froze, glancing at each other with wide eyes. The fire crackled softly, but the mood had shifted. It was no longer just a campfire story. There was something out there. We tried to brush it off, telling ourselves it was just a wolf or a coyote. But deep down, I think we all knew it was something more. The howl was too close, too menacing, and it wasn't alone. Another howl answered from further away, followed by yet another. It felt like they were surrounding us. We decided to call it a night, hoping the walls of the cabin would make us feel safer. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Every creak and groan of the old wood seemed amplified in the silence. We locked the doors and windows, more for our peace of mind than anything else, and tried to settle, and I couldn't sleep. The howls continued throughout the night, growing closer with each passing hour. My heart pounded in my chest, and I kept my eyes on the window, half expecting to see something staring back at me, but there was nothing, just the inky blackness of the forest. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that the howls finally stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse, filled with an oppressive sense of dread. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. We found the tracks around the cabin when we went outside. Large, clawed prints that didn't belong to any animal I knew of. They circled the cabin, overlapping in places, as if whatever had made them had been pacing, watching us from the shadows. One of my friends, Mike, was a hunter, and even he couldn't identify the tracks. He looked shaken, more than I had ever seen him before. He muttered something about getting out of there, that we should cut the trip short, but we all laughed it off, trying to convince ourselves it was just a bear or a large dog. The second night was worse. The howls started earlier, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. They were closer this time, more numerous. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, and every shadow outside the cabin seemed to move. We didn't even bother with the fire that night. We all huddled inside, trying to distract ourselves with card games and small talk, but it was impossible to ignore the fear that had taken root in our minds. At some point the power went out, the lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged us into darkness. We fumbled for flashlights and candles, the small beams of light barely penetrating the inky blackness that had enveloped the cabin. The howls grew louder, more insistent, and we heard something moving outside, heavy footsteps, snapping branches, the sound of something large brushing against the walls. We tried to stay calm, but panic was setting in. Mike grabbed his rifle, the only weapon we had, and stood by the door, his eyes wide and unblinking. We debated what to do, stay inside and hope it would go away, or make a run for the car parked a few hundred yards down the trail. The decision was made for us when something slammed into the side of the cabin. The force of the impact shook the walls, and I could hear the wood creaking under the strain. We all screamed, the sound of our feet echoing in the small space. Mike fired a shot through the door, but whatever was out there didn't retreat. Instead, it growled a low, rumbling sound that made my blood run cold. That's when we saw it, a pair of glowing eyes peering in through the window. They were high off the ground, too high for any normal animal. The light from our flashlights caught a glimpse of matted fur, sharp teeth, and the outline of something that shouldn't exist. It was tall, towering over the cabin, and its eyes burned with a malevolent intelligence. Mike fired again, but the creature didn't flinch. It just stared at us, as if deciding what to do next. We were trapped, helpless against something we couldn't understand. I could feel the terror rising, threatening to consume me. This was no ordinary animal. This was something out of a nightmare. The creature let out a howl, louder than before, and I could hear more of them answering from the woods. We were surrounded. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. There was no way out. We were going to die here, in this cabin, hunted by creatures that shouldn't exist. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature stepped back, retreating into the shadows. The howls grew distant, fading into the night until there was nothing left but silence. We didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, until we were sure it was gone. When dawn finally broke, we didn't waste any time. We packed up whatever we could grab and ran to the car, not looking back. The drive out of the forest was tense, the silence between us heavy with the weight of what we'd just experienced. No one spoke until we were miles away, when the trees thinned and the sun shone brightly overhead. We never talked about what happened that weekend, not really. It was easier to pretend it hadn't happened, to bury the memories deep and move on with our lives. But I know we all think about it, late at night when the world is quiet and the shadows seem a little too dark. I still dream about those eyes, about the feeling of being watched, hunted. I don't go into the woods anymore, not even for a hike. The forest isn't just a place of peace and solitude for me now. It's a place of fear, a reminder that there are things out there that defy explanation, and whatever they are, I hope I never see them again. The invitation arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon, sealed with an elegant wax emblem and addressed to me by name. It was an invitation to a weekend gathering at Maple Grove Manor, a historic estate nestled on the outskirts of town. The letter, written in flowing script, described an exclusive retreat hosted by the enigmatic owner of the manor, a recluse known only as Mr. Harrington. Intrigued by the allure of the manor and the promise of a unique experience, I accepted without hesitation. As I drove up the winding road leading to Maple Grove Manor, the grandeur of the estate came into view. The manor stood atop a hill, its imposing facade adorned with ivy and turrets that seemed to pierce the sky. The surrounding grounds were meticulously maintained, with manicured gardens and a serene pond reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. It was a place out of time, seemingly untouched by the modern world. Upon arrival, I was greeted by Mr. Harrington himself, a tall, distinguished man with an air of mystery about him. He welcomed me with a warm smile and led me into the manor, where I was struck by the opulence of the interior. The ground floor was adorned with intricate tapestries and antique furnishings, and the scent of old books and polished wood filled the air. I was shown to my room, a lavishly decorated suite with a four-poster bed and a stunning view of the gardens. The first evening was spent in socializing with the other guests, who came from various walks of life and seemed as captivated by the manor as I was. Mr. Harrington regaled us with stories about the estate's history, tales of its former inhabitants, and the occasional ghostly legend. The atmosphere was light-hearted and jovial, with laughter echoing through the grand halls. As night fell, the manor took on a different character. The once warm glow of the lamps seemed to cast longer shadows, and the silence of the estate grew more profound. I retired to my room early, eager to rest and prepare for the activities planned for the next day. But sleep was elusive, and I found myself tossing and turning, disturbed by an unsettling feeling that I couldn't quite place. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a sudden cold draft. The temperature in the room had dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath in the dim light. I got up to investigate, checking the windows and doors to see if they were secure. Everything appeared normal, but the feeling of unease remained. As I was about to return to bed, I heard a faint noise coming from the hallway, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Curious, I stepped out into the corridor, following the sound as it grew louder. The tapping led me to a large, ornate door at the end of the hallway, a door I hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, and the tapping seemed to be coming from within. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. Inside, the room was dark and empty, filled with dust-covered furniture and forgotten relics. The tapping continued, coming from an old grandfather clock in the corner. The clock's pendulum swung back and forth, but the clock itself was stopped, its face covered in grime. Suddenly, the tapping stopped, and a chill ran down my spine. I turned to leave, but as I did, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, an ethereal figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman in a flowing dress, her face obscured by shadows. She seemed to be watching me, her presence both haunting and sorrowful. I froze, unable to move as the figure slowly advanced towards me. The air grew colder, and the whispering began, soft, sorrowful murmurs that seemed to emanate from the figure itself. I wanted to call out, to run, but my voice was caught in my throat. Just as the figure reached out towards me, the lights flickered and the temperature returned to normal. The figure vanished, and the grandfather clock began ticking again, its rhythmic sound filling the room. I quickly left the room and returned to my suite, my heart racing and my mind reeling from the encounter. The next morning, I tried to put the previous night's events out of my mind. I joined the other guests for breakfast, but I noticed that they were unusually subdued, as if they had experienced something similar. When I asked Mr. Harrington about the room I had encountered, he seemed taken aback but offered no explanation. He merely smiled and suggested that the manor had a way of revealing its secrets to those who were curious. Throughout the day, the manor seemed to change its demeanor. The once grand halls felt oppressive, and the whispers I had heard the previous night seemed to follow me wherever I went. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the manor itself was alive with a presence that I couldn't fully understand. That evening, as the sun set and the manor was bathed in twilight, Mr. Harrington announced a special event, a séance to communicate with the spirits of the estate. The guests gathered in the grand ballroom, where candles flickered and the air was thick with anticipation. Mr. Harrington led the séance, his voice steady and calming as he attempted to reach out to the other's side. During the séance, the atmosphere grew increasingly intense. The candles flickered wildly, and the temperature dropped once again. The whispers returned, louder and more urgent, and the room seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. The guests were visibly shaken, and I could feel the presence of something malevolent in the room. As the séance concluded, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the ballroom into darkness. Panic set in among the guests, and there was a rush to find a light source. When the lights were restored, Mr. Harrington was nowhere to be found. His absence only added to the sense of dread that had settled over the manor. The following morning, I packed my belongings quickly, eager to leave the manor behind. The once charming estate now felt like a prison, its secrets and shadows too unsettling to ignore. As I drove away, I glanced back at the manor, its turrets and ivy-covered walls standing silent and foreboding. The experience at Maple Grove Manor left me with more questions than answers. The figure I had seen, the whispers, and the chilling atmosphere all pointed to something beyond the ordinary, a haunting that seemed to be deeply rooted in the estate's history. Some places are better left unexplored, and Maple Grove Manor was one such place. It was a crisp fall day when I first heard about Blackwood Park. The park was a sprawling expanse of trees and trails, known locally for its scenic beauty and peaceful ambience. It wasn't until I stumbled upon a conversation at the local diner that I learned about the dark rumors surrounding the place. An elderly man, with a face etched in lines and a voice barely above a whisper, spoke of strange occurrences and unexplained phenomena in the park. He spoke of shadows that moved on their own and voices that echoed through the trees long after dusk. Intrigued by the tales, I decided to investigate. My visit to Blackwood Park started on a sunny afternoon. The park's entrance was marked by an ornate iron gate, its design intricate but weathered with age. The path leading in was lined with tall oak trees whose branches formed a canopy overhead, casting dappled shadows on the ground. The air was crisp and filled with the scent of fallen leaves, creating an atmosphere of tranquility that belied the stories I had heard. As I walked deeper into the park, I noticed that the trails were well maintained, with maps and signs indicating various points of interest. The park seemed picturesque, almost idyllic with its serene lakes and quaint bridges. I followed a trail that led to a secluded area, the park known as the Forgotten Grove, a part of the park that was less frequented and surrounded by an aura of mystery. The Forgotten Grove was indeed different from the rest of the park. The trees here were older, their gnarled branches intertwining to form a dense canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The ground was uneven and covered in a thick carpet of fallen leaves, making each step sound muffled. As I ventured further into the grove, I felt a growing sense of unease. The atmosphere was thick, almost oppressive, and the silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. I continued along the path, my curiosity outweighing my discomfort. After a while, I came across an old, dilapidated building hidden among the trees. It was a small, two-story structure with broken windows and a sagging roof, clearly abandoned for many years. The sight of the building only added to the eerie feeling that had settled over the grove. I approached cautiously, drawn by the allure of its history. The building's door was slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was musty and filled with the scent of decay. The floors were covered in dust, and cobwebs hung from the corners of the ceiling. I moved through the rooms, each one more decrepit than the last, until I reached a small, windowless room at the back of the building. In the center of the room was an old wooden chair, its surface worn and chipped. It was then that I heard a faint, distant sound that seemed to come from outside the building. It was a low, rhythmic drumming, like someone tapping on a drum or knocking on a door. The sound was intermittent, punctuated by brief moments of silence. I listened intently, trying to discern its source, but the sound seemed to come from all directions, echoing through the building. I decided to investigate, stepping back outside into the grove. The drumming sound grew louder as I walked, leading me to a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old stone circle, its purpose and origin unclear. The stones were covered in moss and lichen, and the ground around them was uneven, as if disturbed recently. The drumming sound ceased abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence. As I stood in the clearing, I felt a sudden chill and noticed that the temperature had dropped significantly. The sunlight filtering through the trees seemed dimmer, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. I felt a presence, a sense that I was not alone in the clearing. My skin crawled as I glanced around, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. Suddenly, the drumming sound resumed, louder and more insistent than before. It was accompanied by a low, guttural chanting that seemed to come from beneath the ground. The sound was haunting, a mixture of rhythmic beats and strange, otherworldly tones. I was overwhelmed by a sense of dread and decided it was time to leave. As I turned to leave the clearing, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The shadows in the grove seemed to be shifting, moving in unnatural ways. I caught glimpses of figures darting between the trees, their forms indistinct but menacing. The chanting grew louder, more frenzied, and the air was filled with an oppressive weight. I ran back to the park entrance, my heart racing and my breath coming in short gasps. The tranquility of the park had been replaced by a sense of imminent danger. I didn't stop until I reached my car, and as I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me. The experience at Blackwood Park left me shaken. The park's beauty had masked a hidden terror, a darkness that lurked beneath its serene surface. I couldn't shake the feeling that something ancient and malevolent resided in the grove, something that had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The drumming, the chanting, and the shifting shadows were a stark reminder that some places hold secrets that are better left undisturbed. The invitation came from an old friend, the kind you haven't spoken to in years, but who suddenly reaches out like no time has passed. Jack had moved out to a small town, deep in the heart of Louisiana, where the Spanish moss drapes over everything, and the air is thick with humidity and secrets. He wanted me to visit, said there was something important he needed to talk about. I hesitated at first. Life had its way of creating distance and time between us, but something in his voice caught my attention. There was an urgency there, a desperation I hadn't heard before. I arrived late in the evening, just as the sun was beginning to set. The town was small, barely more than a few streets lined with old, weathered houses. Jack's place was a little out of the way, a large, creaking house that looked as though it had seen better days. The paint was peeling, the windows were dirty, and the front yard was overgrown. I almost turned around and left then, but curiosity got the better of me. Jack greeted me at the door, and the sight of him shocked me. He was thinner than I remembered, his skin pale and his eyes haunted. He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He ushered me inside, quickly glancing nervously over his shoulder as if he was being watched. The house was dark, the kind of dark that feels thick, like it's pressing in on you. The air was heavy with a strange smell, a mix of damp earth and something metallic. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stepped inside. There was something wrong about this place, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. We sat in the living room, and Jack began to talk. At first, it was just small talk, catching up on old times. But then his voice lowered, and he leaned in close, his eyes darting around the room as if he was afraid of being overheard. He told me about the shadows. It started a few months after he moved into the house. At first, it was just little things, a shadow in the corner of his eye that would disappear when he turned to look, objects moving slightly out of place. But it grew worse. The shadows became more distinct, more defined, and they didn't disappear anymore. They would linger. Watching him, he could feel their eyes on him, even though they had no faces. They whispered to him, their voices soft but insistent, filling his mind with dark thoughts, thoughts that weren't his own. He tried to leave, tried to sell the house, but something always stopped him. Buyers would back out at the last minute, or something would go wrong with the paperwork. It was like the house didn't want to let him go. He began to spend more time inside, afraid to leave, afraid of what might happen if he did. The shadows grew bolder, their whispers more demanding. Jack looked at me, his eyes wide with fear, and me thought he was losing his mind. He hadn't slept in days, too afraid of what he might see if he closed his eyes. The shadows were everywhere now, following him from room to room, their voices filling his head. He was sure they were trying to take him, to possess him. He asked me if I believed him, and I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, to tell him it was just his imagination, but the fear in his voice, the look in his eyes, it was too real. He begged me to stay the night, said he couldn't be alone in the house anymore. I agreed, partly because I didn't want to leave him in that state, and partly because I was curious, and terrified of what might happen if I stay. As night fell, the house grew colder, the shadows longer. Jack refused to turn off the lights, but it didn't seem to matter. The shadows were there, lurking in the corners, moving just out of sight. We tried to watch a movie, tried to distract ourselves, but the tension was palpable. Jack kept glancing around the room, his hands trembling. I tried to reassure him, but the truth was I was scared to death. It was around midnight when things took a turn for the worse. The lights flickered, and the air grew even colder. Jack froze, his eyes fixed on a spot across the room. I followed his gaze and saw it a shadow, darker than the others, more solid. It stood in the corner, watching us. My heart raced, and I could feel the fear creeping up my spine. Jack began to shake, his breathing rapid and shallow. The shadow moved closer, and I could see it was more than just a shadow. It had a form, vaguely human, but distorted, wrong. It reached out, and Jack screamed, a sound that chilled me to the bone. He clutched his head, his eyes wide with terror, as the shadow loomed over him. I didn't know what to do. I tried to pull him away, to get him out of the house, but he wouldn't move. The shadow was all around him now, wrapping him in darkness. His screams grew louder, more desperate, as the shadow seemed to seep into his skin, into his mind, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The shadow retreated, fading back into the darkness. Jack collapsed, breathing heavily, his body trembling. I pulled him to his feet, half carrying him out of the house. We drove away, not stopping until we reached the next town. Jack was a wreck, barely coherent. He muttered about the shadows, about how they had almost taken him. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to help. We spent the night in a cheap motel, the lights on the entire time. The next day, Jack was gone. I woke up to find his bed empty, the door to the room wide open. I searched for him, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had just vanished. I went back to the house, but it was empty, abandoned. The door was unlocked, the windows shattered. I stepped inside, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something metallic. The shadows were waiting for me. I didn't stay long. I ran, not stopping until I was far away from that cursed place. I've never been back, never told anyone what happened, that I can't forget. The shadows are always with me now, lurking in the corners of my mind, and sometimes, late at night, I can still hear them whispering my name. It was a typical summer evening when I decided to take a stroll through the local park, a place I had frequented for years without incident. The park was known for its tall pine trees and winding trails, providing a peaceful escape from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. That evening, however, something felt different. As I walked along my usual path, I noticed that the sky was clouded over, casting a dim, gray light over the park. The usual chirping of birds was replaced by an unsettling silence, and the air was unusually still. I shrugged off the odd feeling and continued on my way, admiring the tall pines that loomed over the path. The trail I was on led me deeper into the park, away from the more frequented areas. I had always enjoyed these solitary walks, finding solace in the isolation. But as I ventured further, the familiar sense of peace began to wane, replaced by an inexplicable discomfort. The shadows of the pines seemed to grow darker, their branches stretching out like gnarled fingers. It wasn't long before I reached a small clearing that I had never noticed before. At the center of the clearing was a large, weathered stone, partially covered by moss and surrounded by overgrown grass. The stone looked ancient, and there was something oddly compelling about it. I approached cautiously, drawn by an inexplicable curiosity. As I neared the stone, I noticed a peculiar symbol carved into its surface. The symbol was intricate and unfamiliar, with swirling patterns that seemed to shift and change when I looked at them directly. The symbol gave me an uneasy feeling, and I took a step back, feeling the weight of an unseen presence. The silence in the clearing was absolute, and I felt as though the air itself was holding its breath. Suddenly I heard a faint rustling behind me, followed by a low, guttural growl. My heart raced as I turned around, but the clearing was empty. The sound had come from the direction of the pine trees, and I could see nothing but shadows moving in the dim light. I decided to leave the clearing, my instincts telling me that something was amiss. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of a shadowy figure emerging from the trees. The figure was tall and indistinct, its form blending with the darkness of the forest. It moved with a slow, deliberate pace, its presence both menacing and unsettling. I quickened my pace, hurrying back towards the park entrance. The shadow seemed to follow me, its movement almost synchronized with my own. The rustling in the underbrush grew louder, and I could feel the weight of the figure's gaze on my back. I glanced over my shoulder, but saw only darkness, the figure lost in the shadows. Reaching the park entrance, I glanced back one last time. The shadowy figure was no longer visible, but the sense of being watched persisted. I left the park quickly, my mind racing with questions and fears. Who or what had I encountered in the clearing? The next day I returned to the park with a friend, hoping to find some explanation for the previous night's events. We approached the clearing cautiously, but to my relief, there was no sign of the shadowy figure or the strange symbol. The stone was still there, but it appeared ordinary in the daylight, its symbol now looking like nothing more than weathered markings. Despite the lack of tangible evidence, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me that night. The experience left me with an eerie sense of foreboding, and I avoided the park for some time afterward. The shadows in the pines had seemed alive, their darkness hiding something ancient and malevolent. Even now, whenever I pass by the park, I can't help but glance toward the pines, half expecting to see that shadowy figure emerge from the darkness. The park's beauty is overshadowed by the memory of that night, a reminder that even the most familiar places can harbor hidden terrors. It all began when I agreed to house sit for my cousin, Jake, in a remote part of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Jake had a small cabin nestled deep in the woods, far from the nearest town, the kind of place where cell service was a luxury and neighbors were more of a myth. I hadn't seen Jake in years, and when he called asking for a favor, I didn't think twice. He was heading out of town for a few weeks and needed someone to look after the place. The drive up was long and monotonous, the road winding through dense forests that seemed to stretch on forever. The further I drove, the more isolated I felt. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. Jake's cabin was quaint, almost picturesque, but there was an uneasy feeling in the air, a sense that the forest was watching me. Jake had left a note on the kitchen table, along with a list of chores. Feed the chickens, check the mail, keep an eye out for anything unusual. The last part made me chuckle. What could possibly be unusual out here, in the middle of nowhere? The first few days passed without incident. The chickens were easy to care for, and the cabin, while rustic, had all the amenities I needed. I spent my days exploring the surrounding woods, taking in the tranquility that only such isolation could offer. But as the days went on, I started to notice things, small things at first. like the feeling of being watched or the sound of branches snapping when no one was around. It was on the fifth night that things took a darker turn. I was sitting by the fire, reading, when I heard a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from just outside the cabin. I froze, the book slipping from my hands. The growl came again, closer this time, more menacing. My heart raced as I stood up, peering out the window into the darkness. At first I saw nothing, just the faint outline of the trees against the night sky. But then, in the shadows, I saw movement, a large figure, hunched over, its eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. The creature was massive, easily the size of a large dog, but with a more humanoid shape. It stood on two legs, its body covered in thick, matted fur. Its eyes locked onto mine, and a chill ran down my spine. This wasn't a bear or a wolf. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. The creature let out a snarl, baring its teeth, and I stumbled back, my mind racing. I quickly locked the doors, my hands trembling. The growling continued outside, growing louder, more aggressive. I grabbed the shotgun Jake had left in the corner and loaded it, my breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The creature was circling the cabin now, its growls reverberating through the walls. I could hear its claws scraping against the wood, its breath heavy and labored. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The growling ceased, and the night fell silent once more. I stood there, shotgun in hand, listening to the deafening quiet. After what felt like hours, I finally dared to move, peeking out the window again. The creature was gone, but the sense of unease lingered, heavy in the air. I didn't sleep that night, too afraid that the creature would return. When morning finally came, I ventured outside, my heart pounding in my chest. There, in the dirt around the cabin, were large, clawed footprints, unlike anything I had ever seen before. They were too big to be of wolves, too deep to be of bears. They led from the edge of the woods, circled the cabin, and then disappeared back into the trees. I spent the day trying to rationalize what I had seen, telling myself it must have been a trick of the light, a bear standing on its hind legs, anything to make sense of the creature that had stalked me the night before. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. There was something out there, something unnatural. As night fell, I could feel the fear creeping back in. I locked the doors and windows, checked the shotgun, and settled in for another sleepless night. The woods were eerily quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. And then, just as I was starting to relax, the growling began again. This time, it was closer, more intense. The creature was back, and it was angry. It slammed against the side of the cabin, the force shaking the walls. I could hear it snarling, its claws raking against the wood. My heart pounded in my chest as I gripped the shotgun, praying that the cabin would hold. The assault went on for what felt like hours, the creature relentless in its attack. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost more terrifying than the growling. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, waiting for the next onslaught. But it never came. The creature was gone. The next morning, I found more footprints, deeper this time, as if the creature had been digging, trying to get inside. The walls of the cabin were scratched and gouged, the wood splintered in places. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop. I knew I couldn't stay there another night. I packed my things and left the cabin, driving away as fast as I could. As I looked back, I could see the figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching me go. Its eyes glowed in the morning light, a silent promise that this wasn't over. I didn't tell Jake what had happened when he returned. I didn't have the words to explain what I had seen, and I wasn't sure he would believe me if I did. But I knew I couldn't stay there, couldn't risk another encounter with the creature. Whatever it was still out there, lurking in the shadows of the forest, waiting for its next victim. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching me, that it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. The dogmen, they call it a creature of legend, a myth, but I know the truth. It's real, and it's waiting in the darkness, a curse that can't be escaped. I was working the late shift as a cab driver in a small city that seemed quiet enough to be boring most of the time. The job usually involved the mundane routine of picking up drunks or late-night workers, but there was always a chance that something unusual would happen. It was one such night when I had an encounter that would stay with me forever. Around 11 p.m., I was parked near a popular nightclub, waiting for my next fare. The street was filled with a mix of laughter and loud music from the club, and I was beginning to think it would be another uneventful night. Then a man approached my cab. He was tall and dressed in a dark suit, looking out of place among the revelers. His demeanor was calm, almost eerily so, and his request was straightforward, a ride to an old, abandoned part of town. The address he gave me was for a dilapidated area I knew well but seldom visited. It was a place with crumbling buildings and overgrown weeds, a remnant of the city's past. I was about to ask him why he wanted to go there, but he simply got in and remained silent. I shrugged off the oddity and started driving Dot as we made our way through the dark streets. The atmosphere in the cab grew heavy. The man didn't say a word, and the silence was unsettling. Every now and then I glanced at him through the rearview mirror. He sat perfectly still, his eyes hidden by the brim of his hat. The silence was occasionally broken by the sound of my cab's tires crunching over debris or the distant echo of the city's nightlife. The route took us further into the abandoned district, where the street lights were few and far between. The buildings loomed like ghostly silhouettes against the night sky. I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as I drove. The man's presence was almost palpable, filling the cab with a strange tension. Finally, we reached the destination, an old, derelict warehouse at the end of a long, dark street. I pulled up to the building, which looked even more sinister in the dim light. The man gave no indication of wanting to leave. Instead, he simply sat there, his silence now stark contrast to the sounds of the city behind us. I turned around to ask if he was sure this was the place, but when I looked at him through the rearview mirror, he was gone. The back seat was empty. My heart skipped a beat. I walked up to the warehouse, hoping to find some explanation, but the building was locked and abandoned, its windows boarded up. Feeling unnerved, I returned to my cab and decided to leave the area quickly. As I drove away, I glanced at the passenger seat again, half expecting to see the man there. The streets seemed even darker, and the silence was deafening. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, a sensation that persisted long after I left the abandoned district. The next day, I spoke to some of the locals about the mysterious passenger and the warehouse. To my surprise, none of them had heard of anyone matching his description or knew anything about the warehouse. It was as if the entire encounter had been erased from memory. The area was known for its ghost stories and strange occurrences, but I had never given them much thought until that night. I haven't driven a cab in that part of town since, and the memory of that night lingers with me. It's a reminder that the ordinary can quickly become extraordinary, and that sometimes there are things we encounter that defy logical explanation. The man in the dark suit remains an enigma, a part of an experience I can't fully understand, but will never forget. I had just moved to the small town of Carter's Mill, seeking a quieter life away from the chaos of city living. My new home was an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, with creaky wooden floors and a large, overgrown garden. It was charming in its own way, but it wasn't long before I started noticing things that made me question my decision. It began with small, unsettling occurrences, doors that creaked open on their own, cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere, and the occasional flicker of lights. I brushed these off as quirks of an old house, but the feeling of unease grew stronger as days went by. One evening, while unpacking boxes in the attic, I found an old chest tucked away in a corner. The chest was dusty and covered in cobwebs, its surface scratched and worn. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pried it open. Inside, I discovered a collection of old photographs and letters, each one dating back to the early 1900s. The photographs depicted people in old-fashioned clothing, standing in front of the very house I now lived in. Among the letters was one that stood out, a letter addressed to someone named Elizabeth, written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. The letter spoke of a mysterious presence in the house and warned Elizabeth to leave immediately. It mentioned strange noises and a feeling of being watched, which echoed my own experiences. That night I decided to investigate the history of the house and discovered that it had been owned by a family named Carter in the early 1900s. According to local lore, the family had experienced a series of tragic events and eventually abandoned the house under mysterious circumstances. The rumors suggested that something malevolent had driven them away, but the details were vague. Determined to understand what was happening, I began to pay closer attention to the strange occurrences. I set up a few cameras around the house, hoping to capture something on film. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a series of unsettling noises. Footsteps echoing in the hallway, the sound of a door opening and closing, and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The next morning, I reviewed the footage from the cameras. To my shock, the recordings showed strange, shadowy figures moving through the rooms. The shadows seemed to flicker and shift, their movements erratic and unsettling. There were also inexplicable bursts of static and interference on the video, making it hard to discern what was real and what was not. As the days went by, the disturbances grew more intense. I would hear knocking on doors when no one was there, and cold spots would appear without warning. The atmosphere in the house became oppressive, and I felt a constant sense of being watched. I began to question whether I was imagining things or if something truly sinister was at play. One particularly stormy night, the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check the circuit breaker. As I descended into the basement, I felt a chilling presence, as though I was not alone. The basement was cold and damp, and the air seemed to thicken with each step I took. In the dim light of the flashlight, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing in the corner of the basement, partially obscured by the shadows. The figure was tall and indistinct, its features hidden by the darkness. I froze, my heart racing, and the figure seemed to move closer, its presence almost palpable. Desperate to escape, I turned and fled up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. The house was now filled with an unsettling silence, broken only by the sound of the storm outside. I decided that I needed to leave the house immediately. The following morning, I packed my belongings and left Carter's Mill. The house, with its mysterious history and malevolent presence, was a place I no longer felt safe in. I later learned that the Carter's tragic story was more than just local gossip. It was a part of the town's dark history, a reminder that some places carry shadows of the past that are best left undisturbed. The haunting of Carter's Mill remains a chilling memory, a reminder that sometimes the past is not so easily left behind. The house still stands, a silent witness to the secrets it holds, and I can't help but wonder what other stories it might tell if only the walls could speak. The invitation came unexpectedly. A handwritten note slipped under my door, sealed with red wax and bearing a symbol I didn't recognize. It simply read, "Join us for a night you'll never forget." There was no signature, no indication of who sent it, just a date, time, and location, a clearing deep in the woods about an hour outside of town. Most people would have ignored it, chalked it up to some weird prank. But not me. I was curious for my own good. I grew up in a small town where nothing exciting ever happened. The idea of something mysterious, something out of the ordinary, was too tempting to pass up. So I decided to go, thinking at worst it would be a bunch of kids messing around, and at best, maybe a secret party or some local tradition I'd never heard of. Looking back, I wish I had just stayed home. The night of the invitation was chilly, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. I drove to the edge of the woods and parked my car, the headlights illuminating the narrow path that led into the darkness. I hesitated for a moment. The note crumpled in my pocket, but my curiosity pushed me forward. The forest was eerily quiet as I made my way through the trees. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under my boots. I followed the path for what felt like hours, the darkness swallowing me up, until finally I reached the clearing. It was a wide, open space surrounded by towering pines, the moon casting a pale light over everything. In the center of the clearing was a large stone altar, and around it a circle of people dressed in black robes, their faces hidden by hoods. My first instinct was to turn and run, but something kept me rooted in place. There was a strange energy in the air, a pull that I couldn't resist. One of the robed figures stepped forward, their voice low and melodic as they welcomed me. They called me the Chosen One, and before I could question it, they took my hand and led me into the circle. The ritual began with chanting, the words foreign and rhythmic, reverberating through the clearing. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, as the chanting grew louder, more intense. I tried to focus, to make sense of the words, but they seemed to slip away as soon as I heard them. My heart raced as I realized I was no longer in control, that something was happening to me, something I couldn't stop. The figure leading the ritual raised their hands, and the chanting stopped. The silence was deafening, thick with anticipation. Then, without warning, the figure produced a knife, its blade glinting in the moonlight. They handed it to me, their eyes hidden beneath the hood, but their intent clear. I was to make a sacrifice, but of what I didn't know. Fear gripped me as I took the knife, the weight of it heavy in my hand. I wanted to drop it, to run, but the same force that had drawn me to the clearing now held me there, commanding me to obey. The other figures began to chant again, slower this time, their voices blending into a haunting melody. Before I could make sense of it, an animal, a small, trembling deer, was led into the circle, its eyes wide with fear. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and the figure beside me nodded, urging me to complete the ritual. I raised the knife, my hands shaking, the deer's eyes locked on mine, pleading, but just as I was about to bring the knife down, something inside me snapped. I couldn't do it. I dropped the knife, stumbling back as the chanting turned to angry shots. The robed figures advanced on me, their hoods falling back to reveal faces twisted with rage and disappointment. They weren't human, or at least, not entirely. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, their teeth sharp and pointed, their skin stretched to tight over their bones. I turned and ran, the sounds of their pursuit echoing through the trees. The forest that had seemed so quiet and peaceful before was now alive with movement. Shadows darting between the trees, branches snapping all around me. My lungs burned as I pushed myself harder, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get away, to escape whatever nightmare I had stumbled into. After what felt like hours, I burst out of the woods and onto the road, nearly collapsing from exhaustion. My car was still where I had left it, the engine cold, but I didn't care. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably, before finally getting the door open and starting the engine. I floored it, speeding away from the forest, not daring to look back. When I got home, I locked every door and window, my heart still racing. I didn't sleep that night, too afraid that they would come for me, that I had somehow failed in whatever twisted ritual they had planned. But as the days passed, the fear began to fade, replaced by a nagging curiosity. What had I interrupted that night? What were they trying to summon? I tried to find answers, searching through old books, local legends, anything that might explain what I had seen. But there was nothing, no mention of occult or rituals in the woods. It was as if it had never happened, a figment of my imagination. But I knew better. I knew that somewhere out in those woods they were still waiting, still searching for their chosen one. And every time I close my eyes, I see them, those glowing eyes, those twisted faces, the knife in my hand. I wonder what would have happened if I had gone through with it, if I had made the sacrifice. Would I have become one of them, another twisted soul bound to the forest? Or would something far worse have been unleashed? I'll never know for sure, but one thing is certain: I'll never set foot in those woods again. Some things are better left forgotten, buried in the shadows where they belong. But the memory of that night lingers, a constant reminder of the darkness that exists just beyond the edge of the light. I never believed in monsters. Growing up, I heard the stories, the local legends about creatures that stalked the night, but I always dismissed them as just that, stories. I was a skeptic through and through, grounded in logic and reason. But all that changed one cold autumn night when I encountered something that defied explanation, something that still haunts my dreams. It was late October, the air crisp with the first hint of winter. I had planned a weekend trip to Deep Creek, a secluded spot in the mountains known for its dense forests and clear, starry skies. It was the perfect place to unwind, to escape the noise and stress of city life. I packed my car with the essentials: camping gear, food, a few good books, and set off early in the morning, eager to reach the campsite before dark. The drive was long and winding, the roads narrow and deserted as I climbed higher into the mountains. By the time I reached Deep Creek, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. The campsite was empty, just as I had hoped. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant call of an owl. I set up my tent quickly, then built a small fire to ward off the growing chill. As the night settled in, I found myself relaxing, the stress of the week melting away in the warmth of the fire. I roasted some marshmallows, read a few chapters of my book, and marveled at the vast expanse of stars overhead. It was peaceful, serene, everything I had wanted. But as the fire burned down to embers and the night grew darker, a sense of unease began to creep in. It started with a noise, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from just beyond the circle of light cast by the fire. I froze, straining to hear, but the sound didn't come again. I told myself it was just an animal, a coyote, or maybe a raccoon, and went back to my book. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A few minutes later, I heard it again, closer this time, followed by the snap of a twig. My heart began to race as I scanned the darkness, my eyes trying to pierce the thick wall of trees surrounding the campsite. But there was nothing, just shadows and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, just nerves playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was out there. I decided to call it a night, dousing the fire and retreating to the safety of my tent. I zipped the flap closed, double-checking the lock, then crawled into my sleeping bag, hoping sleep would come quickly and chase away the uneasy feeling. But sleep didn't come. I lay there, wide awake, every little sound outside amplified in the silence. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving slowly around the campsite. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, the footsteps growing louder, closer, until they stopped right outside my tent. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, fear gripping me like a vice. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, praying that whatever it was would just go away. But it didn't. Instead, I heard a low, rumbling growl, followed by a sound that sent chills down my spine, the scratch of claws against the fabric of the tent. Whatever was out there, it was big, bigger than any animal I had ever encountered. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. I had no weapon, no way to defend myself, and the car was too far to make a run for it. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the growling stopped. The footsteps retreated, moving away from the tent and back into the woods. I waited, too terrified to move, straining to hear any sign of its return. Minutes passed, then hours, but the only sounds were the distant calls of night creatures and the soft rustle of leaves. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke up with the first light of dawn, my body stiff from tension and cold. For a moment I wondered if it had all been a dream, a vivid nightmare brought on by the isolation and darkness. But when I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my blood ran cold. The ground around the campsite was torn up, deep gouges in the earth where something had clawed at the ground. The fire pit had been scattered, stones and ash thrown in every direction. But the most disturbing thing was the track's massive paw prints, far too large to belong to any known animal. Circling the tent and leading off into the woods, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking as I worked. I didn't want to stay another minute. Didn't want to find out what had left those tracks or why it had been watching me. I was out of the campsite and on the road within minutes, my heart still pounding as I sped down the mountain, not daring to look back. When I got home, I did some research, trying to make sense of what I had experienced. That's when I first came across the legend of the dogman, a creature said to roam the forests of North America, half man, half elf, with the strength of a bear and the cunning of a predator. The stories were old, passed down through generations, but they all described the same thing, an enormous, beast-like creature with glowing eyes and a hunger for flesh. I wanted to believe it was just a legend, just a story, but the memory of that night, those tracks, wouldn't let me. I haven't been back to Deep Creek since, and I don't plan to. I've heard others tell similar stories, people who've seen things in the woods that defy explanation, but I don't need to hear them to know the truth. The dogman is real, and it's out there somewhere, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next prey. So if you ever find yourself in the woods, alone at night, and you hear footsteps behind you, or a growl in the darkness, do yourself a favor, run. Because once you've seen the dogman, it's already too late. I had always loved hiking, and living near Red Rock Canyon in Nevada provided me with endless opportunities to explore the rugged terrain. The vast, open landscapes, with their towering red cliffs and expansive desert views, were the perfect escape from the bustle of everyday life. But there was one hike I'll never forget, one that still haunts me to this day. It was early spring, and the weather was perfect for a long trek. I had decided to venture off the beaten path, exploring a lesser-known trail that wound its way through the more remote parts of the canyon. The area was known for its isolation, and I relished the thought of spending the day surrounded by nothing but the raw beauty of nature. The trail started out easy enough, with gentle slopes and breathtaking views, but as I ventured deeper into the canyon, the terrain became more challenging. The path narrowed, and the red rock formations grew taller, casting long shadows as the sun began its descent in the sky. Despite the increasing difficulty, I pressed on, eager to see what lay ahead. After several hours of hiking, I found myself in a secluded part of the canyon, far from any sign of civilization. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the desert brush. It was here that I first noticed something strange, a sense that I was being watched. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia, a trick of the mind brought on by the isolation, but as I continued along the trail, the feeling grew stronger. I began to hear faint noises, the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel, the rustle of leaves behind me. Every time I turned around, there was nothing there, just the empty canyon stretching out into the distance. My heart began to race, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. Determined to push through, I quickened my pace, hoping to reach a clearing or a familiar landmark before dusk. But the noises persisted, growing louder and more distinct. At one point I was certain I heard a low growl, deep and guttural, echoing off the canyon walls. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I instinctively reached for the small knife I carried in my pack. The sun was beginning to set, casting an eerie orange glow over the landscape. I knew I needed to turn back before darkness fell, but something compelled me to keep going. It was as if I was being drawn deeper into the canyon by an unseen force that I couldn't resist. The trail became steeper and more treacherous, and the shadows grew longer, swallowing the light. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing on a ledge above me was a figure, tall and gaunt, with unnaturally long limbs and a face that seemed more animal than human. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its skin was a sickly, mottled gray. It stood there, motionless, watching me with an intensity that made my heart pound in my chest. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure made no move to approach, but its presence was overwhelming, a tangible force that pressed down on me. I wanted to run, to flee back down the trail, and never look back, but my legs refused to move. I could only stare, paralyzed by fear, as the figure slowly began to descend the ledge. It moved with a fluid, unnatural grace, its limbs bending in ways that defied logic. As it drew closer, I could see its features more clearly, the elongated face, the sharp, predatory eyes, and the twisted grin that stretched across its face. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, a creature straight out of a nightmare. Finally, my instincts kicked in, and I turned and bolted down the trail. The rough terrain that had slowed me before now seemed to fly by in a blur as I ran faster than I ever had in my life. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind me, footsteps, the scrape of claws on rock, and that low, menacing growl that chilled me to the bone. I didn't stop running until I reached the main trail, where the landscape opened up and the setting sun bathed the canyon in a golden light. The noises behind me had ceased, and when I finally dared to look back, there was nothing there. The figure was gone, as if it had never existed. I hurried back to my car, my heart still racing, and drove home in a daze. The encounter left me shaken, and I couldn't bring myself to return to Red Rock Canyon for weeks. When I finally did, I stuck to the well-traveled paths, never venturing too far from other hikers. Over time, I began to hear stories from the locals, whispers of a creature that roamed the remote parts of the canyon, a being from Native American legend known as a skinwalker. The descriptions matched what I had seen, and the thought of it sent shivers down my spine. I knew then that what I had encountered was no ordinary animal, but something far more sinister, something that lurked in the shadows, waiting for those who dared to wander too far. The Skinwalker of Red Rock Canyon is a story I don't often share, but it's one that I can never forget. The canyon, once a place of peace and solitude, now holds a dark and terrifying memory, a reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation, and that some paths are better left unexplored. It was supposed to be a normal Saturday night. I had just finished a long week at work and was looking forward to a quiet evening at home, maybe watch a movie, order some takeout, and get to bed early. The neighborhood I lived in wasn't exactly the best, but it wasn't the worst either, just an old, run-down part of town where everyone kept to themselves. My apartment was on the third floor of an old brick building, the kind with creaky floors and drafty windows, but it was home, and I felt safe there. That night, after a quick dinner, I decided to call it an early night. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and made sure everything was secure before heading to bed. I remember lying there, listening to the sounds of the city outside, distant sirens, the occasional honk of a car horn, and the murmur of voices from the street below. It was comforting in a way, familiar, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. But then, in the early hours of the morning, something woke me up. At first, I wasn't sure what it was, just a feeling, a sense that something wasn't right. I lay there in the dark, my heart starting to race as I strained to hear. That's when I noticed the sound of soft footsteps, faint but unmistakable, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. I lived alone, and I knew for a fact that I had locked the front door. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, trying to make sense of what was happening. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just my neighbor. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Suddenly, the doorknob started to turn, slowly, deliberately, as if someone was trying to open it without making a sound. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, my hands shaking as I fumbled to unlock it. I was about to call the police when the door creaked open, just an inch, but enough to make my blood run cold. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing as I pressed myself against the wall, trying to stay out of sight. The door continued to open, inch by inch, until I could see a figure standing in the doorway, a tall, dark silhouette, barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. For a moment I was frozen in place, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Then, as if snapped out of a trance, I bolted for the window, throwing it open and scrambling out onto the fire escape. I didn't care that I was 3 stories up or that I was in nothing but my pajamas. I just knew I had to get out of there. As I climbed down the fire escape, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, faster now, more urgent, like whoever was in my apartment had realized I was escaping. I didn't dare look back, didn't want to see what was chasing me. I just kept going, my hands slipping on the cold metal as I descended as quickly as I could. When I finally reached the ground, I took off running down the alley, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could still hear the footsteps behind me, getting closer, the sound of something metallic clanging against the fire escape as they followed me down. I didn't stop until I reached the end of the alley and burst out onto the street, where I finally dared to glance back. But when I turned around, there was nothing there, no one following me, no sign of the figure that had been in my apartment. I stood there, panting, my heart racing, as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it all? Was it some kind of nightmare? But the cold air on my skin and the pain in my hands from gripping the fire escape told me otherwise. This was real. I didn't go back to the apartment that night. Instead, I went straight to the police station, shaking as I told them what had happened. They sent officers to check out my apartment, but when they got there, they found nothing, no sign of forced entry, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. It was like it had never happened, but I knew better. I knew what I had seen, what I had heard. Someone or something had broken into my apartment that night, and it wasn't just a random burglar. The way they moved, the way they watched me, it felt personal, deliberate, like they knew I was there, like they were looking for me specifically. I never went back to that apartment. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been in my apartment was still out there, waiting, watching. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can still hear those footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing in my mind, reminding me that no matter where I go, I'm never truly safe. Evergreen Manor was the kind of place that stuck with you. The old Victorian mansion had stood for over a century, its once grand architecture now faded with time. The sprawling estate, tucked away in a quiet corner of upstate New York, had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. Yet, despite its dilapidated state, the house held a strange allure. Local legends whispered of tragic events, ghostly apparitions, and a curse that had befallen its inhabitants. These stories had always fascinated me, so when the opportunity arose to explore the manor, I couldn't resist. It was a crisp autumn morning when I arrived at Evergreen Manor. The air was thick with the scent of decaying leaves, and a layer of fog clung to the ground, shrouding the mansion in an eerie haze. The iron gates, once majestic, were now rusted and twisted, barely clinging to their hinges. As I pushed them open, they groaned in protest, echoing through the stillness of the morning. The driveway was overgrown with weeds, and the once meticulously manicured gardens had long since succumbed to nature. The house itself loomed ahead, its tall windows like dark eyes staring out at the world. The front door was ajar, as if inviting me in or perhaps warning me to stay away. I hesitated for a moment, a sudden unease creeping up my spine, but curiosity won out. With a deep breath, I stepped inside. The interior was just as I had imagined, dusty, decayed, and utterly abandoned. The grand staircase, once the centerpiece of the floor, was now a rotting skeleton of its former self. Faded wallpaper peeled away from the walls, revealing dark, moldy patches beneath. The air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and mildew, mixed with something else, something I couldn't quite place. It was a smell that made my stomach turn, like rotten meat left out for far too long. I wandered through the halls, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that coated the floor. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house settling. The rooms were filled with remnants of the past, broken furniture, tattered curtains, and old photographs. that stared out at me from their cracked frames. Each step deeper into the house seemed to take me further back in time, as if the walls themselves held the memories of those who had lived and died within them. As I explored, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. It was as if the house was watching me, its walls whispering secrets just out of earshot. The unease that had plagued me at the entrance grew stronger with each passing minute, but I pushed it aside. I had come to explore, to uncover the truth behind the legends, and I wasn't about to let fear stop me. I made my way to the second floor, where the bedrooms were located. The stairs creaked under my weight, and the banister wobbled dangerously, but I managed to reach the top without incident. The hallway was long and narrow, lined with doors led to rooms that had once been filled with life. I opened each door cautiously, peering inside to find nothing but more decay and dust. But as I approached the end of the hall, I noticed one door that was different from the others. It was slightly ajar, and, unlike the others, it was free of dust, as if it had been used recently. My heart quickened as I pushed the door open, revealing a bedroom that seemed frozen in time. The bed was neatly made, the sheets crisp and clean. A small vanity stood in the corner, its mirror reflecting the dim light from the window. The room was eerily pristine, untouched by the decay that had overtaken the rest of the house. It was as if someone had been here just moments before I arrived. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of who might have been there. That's when I noticed a diary lying open on the bed. The pages were yellowed with age, but the writing was clear, as if it had been written only yesterday. I picked it up, my hands trembling slightly, and began to read. The diary belonged to a woman named Eliza, who had lived in the house many years ago. Her entries spoke of a happy life, filled with love and laughter. But as I read further, the tone grew darker. She wrote of strange occurrences in the house and explained noises, cold spots, and the feeling of being watched. She spoke of her husband, who had become increasingly distant, consumed by an obsession with the house. The last entry was the most disturbing. It spoke of a night when Eliza had awoken to find her husband standing over her, his eyes dark and hollow. He had whispered something she couldn't understand, and then nothing. The entry ended abruptly, the rest of the page blank. A chill ran down my spine as I closed the diary, the feeling of unease now overwhelming. I placed the diary back on the bed and turned to leave. But as I reached the door, I heard it a soft, almost inaudible whisper. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper grew louder, filling the room, and I realized it was coming from the diary. I turned back to see the pages flipping on their own, as if an invisible hand was guiding them. The room grew colder, the air thick with a palpable sense of dread. Suddenly the door slammed shut behind me, and I was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and when I finally managed to turn it on, I saw her Eliza standing at the foot of the bed, her face pale and expressionless, her eyes locked on mine. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I backed away slowly, my mind racing with fear and disbelief. This couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. But as I reached the door, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and a voice, soft and haunting, whispered in my ear, "You shouldn't have come here." I bolted from the room, not daring to look back. The house seemed to come alive as I ran, the walls groaning and the floors creaking beneath my feet. I could hear footsteps behind me, matching my pace, growing louder and more frantic. I didn't stop until I burst through the front door and out into the open air. I ran to my car, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and drove away without looking back. The house faded into the distance, swallowed by the fog, but the terror remained. I could still feel her eyes on me, still hear her voice whispering in my ear. Evergreen Manor was no ordinary haunted house. It was a place of darkness, a place where the past lingered, and where the dead did not rest. I never returned to Evergreen Manor, but the memories of that day have stayed with me. The house, with its crumbling walls and haunted history, left an indelible mark on my soul. I often wonder about Eliza, about what happened to her and her husband, and whether their spirits still roam the halls of that cursed mansion. But some questions are better left unanswered, and some places are better left forgotten. The late summer sun was beginning to dip below the horizon as we set up camp. I had been looking forward to this trip for months, a weekend of hiking and camping in the deep woods, far away from the noise and stress of the city. There were four of us: me, my best friend Mike, his girlfriend Sarah, and her brother Jake. We had all grown up in the area, but none of us had ever ventured this far into the woods before. The promise of untouched wilderness and the chance to disconnect from the world was too enticing to pass up. By the time the tent was pitched and the fire was crackling, the sky had turned a deep shade of orange, the first stars beginning to twinkle in the fading light. We sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and swapping stories, laughing at the thought of how out of place we felt in such a remote area. The woods were eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl to remind us we weren't alone out here. As the night grew darker, the conversation turned to local legends. Mike, always the storyteller, began to recount the tale of the dogman, a creature said to roam these very woods. Half man, half wolf, the dogman was supposedly a relic of ancient times, a guardian of the forest that would appear to those who dared to trespass too deep into its territory. We laughed it off, chalking it up to nothing more than a campfire story meant to spook us. But as the fire burned lower and the darkness closed in around us, the laughter faded, leaving behind a sense of unease that none of us could quite shake. It was around midnight when we decided to call it a night. The fire was reduced to glowing embers, and the temperature had dropped enough to make us pull our jackets tighter around ourselves. We retreated to the tent, zipping it up securely and settling into our sleeping bags. The forest was silent now, unnervingly so, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees and the soft breathing of my friends as they drifted off to sleep. I don't know how long I had been lying there, half awake, half asleep, when I heard it. At first I thought it was just the wind, a low, distant howl carried on the breeze. But as I listened, it grew louder, more distinct, until there was no mistaking it for anything but the howl of some large animal. My heart began to race as I sat up, straining to hear through the thin walls of the tent. The howling continued, growing closer with each passing second. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as a primal fear took hold of me. This wasn't just some coyote or stray dog, it was something bigger, something far more dangerous. I glanced over at Mike, who was still fast asleep, oblivious to the noise outside. I debated waking him, but before I could make a decision, the howling stopped, replaced by the sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush just outside the tent. My blood ran cold as I realized whatever was out there was circling our camp, its footsteps slow and deliberate, like it was stalking us. I held my breath, my mind racing as I tried to figure out what to do. Should I wake the others? Should I grab the knife we had brought for cutting firewood? Or should I just stay still and hope it went away? The footsteps grew closer, so close now that I could hear the sound of twigs snapping under its weight. And then, through the thin fabric of the tent, I saw a shadow, tall and hulking, moving just beyond the firelight. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make out what it was, but the darkness and the shadowy figure combined to create a terrifying silhouette that defied logic. For what felt like an eternity, the figure stood there just outside the tent, its presence heavy and oppressive. I could hear it breathing, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and walked away, its footsteps fading into the distance. Until they were swallowed by the night, I sat there in stunned silence, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Had I really seen something, or was it just my imagination playing tricks on me in the darkness? I wanted to believe it was the latter, but deep down I knew better. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds chirping and the soft light of dawn filtering through the tent. For a moment, I could almost convince myself that the events of the night before had been nothing more than a bad dream. But as I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the truth became undeniable. Dot around our campsite, the ground was disturbed, the dirt and leaves scattered as if something heavy had been walking through. And there, just beyond the edge of the clearing, were tracks large, paw-like prints, far too big to belong to any normal animal. They were deep, the kind of prints that could only be made by something with a lot of weight behind it. I called the others over, and we all stared at the tracks in stunned silence. No one said a word, but the fear was palpable. We packed up camp as quickly as we could, eager to leave the woods and whatever had been stalking us behind Dot. As we hiked back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful and inviting just a day before, now felt menacing, like it was hiding something just beyond the trees. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadowy figure following us, but the woods remained quiet, almost too quiet. When we finally reached the car, we threw our gear in the trunk and piled in, eager to put as much distance between us and those woods as possible. As we drove away, the tension in the car was thick, no one daring to speak. It wasn't until we were miles away, back in the safety of civilization, that Mike finally broke the silence. "Do you think it was the dogman?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. None of us answered, but the look on everyone's face said it all. We didn't want to believe it, didn't want to acknowledge that the old legend might be real. But the tracks, the howling, the shadowy figure, there was no denying that something was out there, something that wasn't supposed to exist. We never went back to those woods, and we never spoke of that night again. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed and the wind howls outside my window, I can't help but think about the dogman and wonder if it's still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next unsuspecting victim to wander too deep into its territory. It was supposed to be a routine patrol. As a park ranger, I had spent countless hours roaming the vast expanse of timberland forest, ensuring the safety of visitors and maintaining the natural beauty of the land. But that day was different. The forest, usually filled with the sounds of wildlife and the rustling of leaves, was eerily silent. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the forest floor. I had been tasked with checking on an area of the park that had recently been closed to the public. A series of strange events had been reported and explained: disappearances, odd noises at night, and sightings of a large, shadowy figure that no one could quite describe. The locals had their own theories, ranging from escaped wildlife to supernatural beings. But I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories or legends. I chalked it up to the imagination running wild, especially in a place as remote and mysterious as timberland. The trail leading to the closed-off section of the park was overgrown, as if nature itself was trying to reclaim the land. The trees here were older, their trunks thick and gnarled, and their branches twisted together to form a dense canopy overhead. The further I walked, the darker it became, until it felt as though I was entering another world entirely. As I ventured deeper into the forest, a sense of unease began to settle over me. The silence was oppressive, the only sound being the crunch of leaves under my boots. There was no sign of life, not a bird in the sky, not a squirrel in the trees. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. It was as if the forest was waiting for something or someone. I reached the heart of the restricted area just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon. The temperature dropped suddenly, and a thick fog began to roll in, swirling around the trees like tendrils of smoke. My radio crackled to life, a burst of static that made me jump. I tried to contact the ranger station, but the signal was weak, and all I could hear was the faint sound of a voice I didn't recognize, garbled and distant. That's when I saw movement in the trees ahead, a large figure, too big to be any animal I knew of, moving silently between the trunks. I froze, my hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight strap to my belt. I flicked it on, the beam cutting through the fog like a knife, but there was nothing there. The figure had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. My heart was racing, every instinct telling me to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But my training, and perhaps a stubborn sense of duty, kept me rooted to the spot. I had to find out what was going on, even if it meant confronting whatever was out there. I continued forward, every sense on high alert. The fog grew thicker, swirling around me, until I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. I wasn't alone in this forest. I could sense it, a presence just beyond my sight, lurking in the shadows. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, unlike anything I had ever heard before. It rumbled through the trees, vibrating the very ground beneath my feet. I swung the flashlight around, trying to pinpoint the source, but all I could see was the fog, thick and impenetrable. The growl came again, closer this time, and I knew I had to get out of there. I turned and started to run, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest seemed to shift around me, the trees blurring into one another as I raced through the underbrush. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I stumbled, my foot catching on a root, and I went down hard, the breath knocked out of me. As I lay there, struggling to get up, I felt it hot, foul breath on the back of my neck. I froze, my mind screaming at me to move, but my body refused to obey. The growl came again, so close it rattled my bones. Slowly I turned my head, and there was a massive, hulking figure, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It was like nothing I had ever seen, a creature out of nightmares, all teeth and claws, and a darkness that seemed to swallow the light around it. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline surging through me, and ran like I had never run before. The creature was right behind me. I could feel its presence, its eyes boring into my back. The forest was a blur, the trees whipping past me as I tore through the underbrush, branches slashing at my face and arms. I didn't care. All I knew was that I had to get up. I had to survive. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I burst out of the forest and onto the main trail. The fog dissipated as suddenly as it had appeared, and the sounds of the forest returned, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, my heart still racing. I looked back at the forest. expecting to see the creature emerge from the trees, but there was nothing. The forest was calm, peaceful even. As if nothing had happened, I staggered to my feet and made my way back to the ranger station, my mind racing with what I had just experienced. When I arrived, I was greeted by concerned faces, my fellow rangers asking what had happened, where I had been. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. How could I describe what I had seen, what I had felt? It seemed impossible, like something out of a nightmare, but the terror was all too real. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened, but the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. The creature, the fog, the silence of the forest, it all felt like a bad dream, but the scratches on my arms and the fear in my heart told me otherwise. I knew what I had seen, what had chased me through the woods that night, and I knew I would never forget it. Timberland Forest was never the same for me after that. I continued my duties as a park ranger, but I avoided the area where it had happened, steering clear of the shadows and the fog. I never spoke of it to anyone, not really, because I knew they wouldn't believe me. How could they? It was the kind of story that belonged in campfire tales, not in the reality of a park ranger's life. But I knew the truth. There was something in those woods, something ancient and dark, something that watched and waited in the silence, and it wasn't done with me yet. Moving into Blackwood Manor was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter for my family. After years of living in cramped apartments and constantly moving due to work, we finally found a place to call home. The manor was a sprawling, old-fashioned house nestled in the countryside, surrounded by acres of dense woods. It was the kind of place where you could picture raising a family, with its wide-open spaces, grand rooms, and a sense of history that seemed to seep from the very walls. From the moment we saw it, my wife and I were captivated. Sure, it was a bit run down and it needed some work, but we saw it as a project, something we could shape and mold into our dream home. The kids were thrilled, too, especially our eldest, Emily, who immediately claimed the attic room as her own. It was a quirky space, with slanted ceilings and a small, round window that looked out over the forest. She loved the idea of having her own private hideaway, far removed from the rest of the house. The first few weeks in Blackwood Manor were blissful. We spent our days unpacking, decorating, and exploring the property. The house had its quirks, as all old houses do: creaky floorboards, drafty windows, and the occasional flickering light, but we chalked it up to the age of the place and nothing more. The kids quickly settled into their new routines, and for the first time in years, we felt at peace. But then things started to change. It began with small, almost imperceptible things. Emily, who had always been an adventurous and outgoing child, started to withdraw. She spent more and more time in her attic room, often refusing to come down for dinner or to play with her siblings. When we asked her what was wrong, she would only shrug and say she was tired or that she just wanted to be alone. We figured it was just a phase, something to do with adjusting to the new house, and we didn't press the issue. Then, one night, I was awoken by the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was one of the kids wandering around, but when I got up to check, everyone was sound asleep in their beds. The footsteps continued, a slow, deliberate pacing back and forth across the floor above us, Emily's attic room. I went up to check on her, but when I opened the door, the room was empty. The bed was unmade, the window open, letting in a cold breeze that sent a shiver down my spine. I called out for her, but there was no answer. Panic set in, and I rushed through the house, waking my wife and searching every room. We eventually found Emily sitting at the bottom of the stairs, her eyes wide and unfocused. She didn't remember leaving her room, didn't remember how she got downstairs. She only said that she had a nightmare, that something had been watching her from the shadows of her room. We comforted her as best we could and put her back to bed, but that night, sleep didn't come easily for any of us. The next day, I decided to investigate the attic more thoroughly. The room had always had a strange feeling about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. As I searched, I noticed something odd about the wall, small, barely visible scratches, as if something with sharp claws had been trying to get out. I felt a chill run down my spine as I traced the marks with my fingers, realizing that they formed a pattern, a spiral that seemed to converge on the center of the room. I didn't mention what I had found to my wife. I didn't want to worry her, especially since I wasn't even sure what I was looking at. But that night the footsteps returned, louder and more insistent, echoing through the house like a taunt. Again I went to check on Emily, and again I found her at the bottom of the stairs, dazed and confused. This time she spoke of a voice, a whisper that called to her from the walls, telling her to come closer, to follow. As the days turned into weeks, the incidents became more frequent. Doors would open and close on their own, objects would move without explanation, and the once warm and welcoming atmosphere of Blackwood Manor began to shift, taking on a darker, more oppressive tone. My wife and I started to argue more, the stress of the situation wearing on us. The other children became withdrawn, spending their days huddled together, their once lively laughter replaced by nervous whispers. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard the whispering myself. It was faint at first, barely audible, but as I strained to listen, it grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from Emily's room this time, it was right outside our door. I shot up in bed, my heart racing, and flung the door open. But there was nothing there. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving only a heavy silence in its wake. Desperate for answers, I began to research the history of Blackwood Manor. What I discovered sent a chill through my bones. The house had a dark past, one that had been carefully hidden from us when we purchased it. Decades ago, a family had lived here, much like ours. They too had been drawn to the charm and history of the manor, but their time here had ended in tragedy. The daughter, a girl about Emily's age, had become obsessed with the attic room, claiming that she spoke to a man who lived in the walls. Her parents had dismissed it as an imaginary friend, but as the weeks went on, the girl's behavior grew more erratic. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and eventually she disappeared. They found her body in the woods months later, her face frozen in a twisted expression of terror. The house had stood empty for years after that, passed from owner to owner, each one staying for only a short time before leaving abruptly. The stories of hauntings and strange occurrences were buried in local folklore, whispered among the townspeople, but never spoken aloud. I knew then that we had to leave. Whatever was in this house, it wasn't something we could fight or reason with. It had latched on to Emily, and I feared it wouldn't stop until it took her, just as it had taken the girl before her. I told my wife everything, showed her the history I had uncovered, and together we made the decision to get out, to leave Blackwood Manor, and never look back. But leaving wasn't as simple as we had hoped. The night before we were set to go, the house seemed to come alive, as if it knew we were trying to escape. The walls shook, the lights flickered, and the air grew thick with a sense of dread. Emily was nowhere to be found. We searched the house from top to bottom, but she was gone. Panic set in, the kind of fear that grips you by the throat and refuses to let go. I knew where she was. There was only one place she could be, the attic. I raced up the stairs, my wife closed behind me, and burst into the room. The sight that met my eyes will haunt me forever. Emily was standing in the center of the room, her eyes fixed on the small window. She was murmuring something under her breath, words I couldn't understand, as if she were in a trance. The walls around her were moving, shifting as if they were alive, and the scratches I had seen before were now deep grooves, forming a spiral that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. I grabbed Emily, shaking her out of her trance, and pulled her towards the door. But the room fought back, the walls closing in, the floorboards creaking and buckling under our feet. We stumbled down the stairs, the house groaning and shaking as if it were trying to trap us inside. Somehow we made it out, bursting through the front door and into the cold night air. As we ran towards the car, I glanced back at the house one last time. The attic window, Emily's window, was glowing with a soft, eerie light, and I could swear I saw a figure standing there, watching us leave. We never returned to Blackwood Manor. We packed up our things and left the town as quickly as we could, leaving behind the house and the nightmares that came with it. Emily never spoke of what happened that night, and we didn't press her, but the change in her was undeniable. She was quieter, more withdrawn, and there was a shadow in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Years have passed since we left Blackwood Manor, but the memory of that place still lingers, a dark stain on our lives. We've tried to move on, to forget, but some things can't be forgotten. The house is still there, standing silent and empty, waiting for the next family to come along, drawn in by its charm and history, unaware of the darkness that lurks within its walls. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if we hadn't left when we did. If we had stayed one more night, would we have all ended up like the family before us? Or would the house have let us go, satisfied with what it had taken from us? I'll never know, and I pray I never find out. All I know is that we survived, and for that I am grateful. But the scars left by Blackwood Manor run deep, and I know that no matter how far we run, we will never truly escape its grasp. I was nearing the end of my shift, the kind of shift that makes you question every life choice that brought you to this point. As a night watchman for an old, decrepit factory that hadn't seen real production in decades, I was paid to babysit a crumbling relic of the past. My job was simple: walk the perimeter, make sure no one broke in, and keep an eye on the few working security cameras in the control room. But simplicity often bred monotony, and monotony bred carelessness. It was a Tuesday night, cold and quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, making you feel like the only person left in the world. The factory sat on the outskirts of town, far from the bustle of civilization, surrounded by acres of overgrown weeds and rusted-out machinery. The place was a labyrinth of dark corridors, endless rows of forgotten machinery, and shadowy corners where the light from my flashlight could barely reach. I had just finished my final round, the familiar path through the factory that I'd walked 100 times before. The control room, my little sanctuary in this desolate place, was warm and dimly lit, with screens showing grainy footage from the few cameras that still worked. I sank into the battered office chair, ready to count down the last few minutes of my shift. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a glitch, just another in the long list of technical issues that plagued the factory. But the longer I stared at the screen, the more certain I became that what I was seeing was real. In the far corner of the factory, where the cameras rarely picked up anything other than dust motes floating in the stale air, there was movement. A shadow, dark and indistinct, flitting across the screen like a wisp of smoke. I leaned in closer, my breath fogging up the glass of the monitor. The shadow moved again, this time more deliberately, as if whatever it was knew I was watching. My first instinct was to dismiss it as a trick of the light or a stray animal, but the shadow was too large, too human-like. It seemed to glide rather than walk, its form shifting and changing with every step. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the radio that connected me to the local police. But what was I going to say? That I saw a shadow on a screen in an old factory. They'd laugh me off the line. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and headed back out into the cold, dark corridors of the factory. The air was thick with the smell of oil and rust, the kind of smell that clings to your clothes and skin long after you've left. My footsteps echoed off the concrete walls, the sound bouncing back at me in a way that made it hard to tell if I was alone. I followed the path the shadow had taken on the monitor, my heart pounding in my chest as I rounded each corner. When I reached the spot where I had seen the movement, there was nothing there, just an empty corridor, the walls stained with years of neglect. But the unease that had settled in my gut refused to go away. I shone my flashlight around the room, the beam flickering as the batteries began to die. For a moment, the light caught something, a glint of metal, a reflection of ice, but when I whipped the flashlight back, there was nothing. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Maybe I was just tired, my mind playing tricks on me in the dark. I turned to leave, ready to finish my shift and get out of this place, when I heard it, a sound so faint I almost missed it, a whisper, soft and insistent, coming from somewhere deep within the factory. I froze, my flashlight flickering again before it died, completely plunging me into darkness. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, filling the corridor with a sound that was both familiar and alien at the same time. It was as if the walls themselves were speaking, the factory coming to life after years of silence. I reached for my radio, my fingers fumbling in the dark, but before I could call for help, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again, the shadow, standing at the far end of the corridor, watching me. I don't know what possessed me to move forward, but I did. One foot in front of the other, my heart hammering in my chest as I approached the figure. The closer I got, the more I realized that this was no ordinary shadow. It was darker than the darkness around it, its edges shifting and blurring as if it were made of smoke. And as I stood just a few feet away, it began to take shape, solidifying into something that resembled a man, but wasn't. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was watch as the shadow man lifted a hand, its fingers long and thin, almost skeletal, and pointed at me. And then, without warning, it lunged forward, moving faster than anything I had ever seen. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet as I tried to get away, but it was too late. The shadow engulfed me, cold and suffocating, like being wrapped in a shroud of pure darkness. I could feel it seeping into my skin, my mind pulling me down into a void that felt endless. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the sound of my own screams echoing off the walls of the factory. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold concrete floor, the lights of the factory flickering above me. My head throbbed, and my body felt like it had been through a meat grinder. I had no idea how long I had been out, but the sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale light through the broken windows of the factory. I staggered to my feet, my legs trembling as I made my way back to the control room. The screens were blank, the cameras dead, and the radio was nothing but static. I tried to collect my thoughts, to make sense of what had happened, but the memories were fragmented, like pieces of a shattered mirror. I never went back to that factory. I quit my job the next day, leaving without saying a word to anyone. And though I tried to forget what happened, the memory of that shadowy figure haunts me still. Sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, I can feel it lurking just beyond the edge of my consciousness, waiting for the day when I let my guard down. I don't know what it was that I saw that night, and I don't think I ever will. But one thing is certain, there are things in this world that we're not meant to understand, things that exist in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And once you've encountered them, there's no going back. We moved to the small town of Ashford in the middle of autumn. The place was picturesque, with its quaint cottages, cobblestone streets, and thick forests that seemed to embrace the town from all sides. My husband and I had decided to settle here after he got a job as the town's new doctor. It was the kind of place he had always dreamed of, raising our children a safe, close-knit community far from the noise and chaos of the city. The house we bought was charming, a little two-story cottage on the edge of the woods, with a large backyard where our two boys could play. It seemed perfect, almost too perfect. The townspeople were friendly enough, welcoming us with smiles and polite conversation, but there was something in their eyes, a guardedness that I couldn't quite place. They often glanced towards the woods with a nervousness that made me uneasy. When I asked about the forest, they would quickly change the subject or brush it off with a vague warning to stay on the paths and never venture too deep. It was odd, but I figure it was just local superstition, something to add to the town's old-world charm. At first, everything was wonderful. The boys, Michael and Oliver, loved their new home and spent hours playing in the yard. They were particularly fascinated by the woods, constantly asking if they could explore the forest trails. My husband and I were cautious, reminding them to stay close to the house and not wander off too far. They were good kids, and we trusted them to be careful. One evening, as the sun was setting, Michael came running into the house, breathless and wide-eyed. He was excited, saying that he had found something in the woods, a tree house. He described it in vivid detail, talking about how it was hidden among the trees, with a rope ladder and old wooden planks that creaked underfoot. Oliver backed him up, saying that it looked abandoned but was still in good enough shape to climb up and explore. I was surprised. We hadn't noticed any tree houses in the area, and it wasn't something the realtor had mentioned when we bought the house. I asked the boys to show me, and they eagerly led me into the woods. We walked for about 10 minutes, following a narrow trail that wound through the trees, the leaves crunching underfoot. The deeper we went, the darker it became, the dense canopy blocking out the remaining daylight. Eventually, we reached a small clearing, and there, nestled between the tall oaks, was the treehouse. It was just as the boys had described, an old, weathered structure with a rope ladder hanging down from the entrance. It looked like it had been there for years, forgotten and untouched. I felt a pang of unease as I stared at it. Something about the treehouse didn't feel right, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The boys were already clambering up the ladder, laughing and shouting with excitement. I stood at the base of the tree, watching them with a mix of worry and curiosity. As they explored the inside, I noticed something strange. The woods around us had grown unnaturally quiet. There was no bird song, no rustling of leaves, nothing but the sound of the boys' voices echoing through the trees. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I called out to the boys, telling them it was time to come down. They reluctantly agreed, and we made our way back to the house, the silence following us like a shadow. That night, as I was tucking the boys into bed, Michael asked asked if they could go back to the treehouse the next day. I hesitated, feeling a knot of dread tighten in my chest, but I didn't want to scare them. I told them we could talk about it in the morning, kissed them good night, and went downstairs to discuss it with my husband. He was just as surprised as I was about the treehouse. He hadn't noticed it on his walks either, and we both agreed that it was odd that something like that hadn't been mentioned during the sale of the house. Still, we didn't want to overreact. It was just a treehouse, after all, old, abandoned, and harmless. We decided to let the boys have their fun, but made a mental note to check it out ourselves in the daylight just to be safe. The next morning, the boys were up early, eager to return to the treehouse. My husband and I followed them, determined to inspect the structure more thoroughly. The walk seemed longer this time, the trail more overgrown than I remembered. When we reached the clearing, the treehouse was there, unchanged, but the air was heavy with that same unsettling silence. My husband climbed up to the treehouse first, testing the wood for stability. It creaked under his weight, but held firm. Inside, the treehouse was empty, just a few old boards and some scattered leaves. There was nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to suggest why it felt so wrong. Still, the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. We decided that the boys could play there, but only if one of us was with them, and they were not to stay out too late. As the days passed, the boys became more and more obsessed with the treehouse. They even started bringing things from the house to keep their blankets, snacks, and toys. I tried not to worry, but the nagging feeling that something wasn't right kept growing. One afternoon, as I was washing dishes, I glanced out the window and noticed that the boys were still in the treehouse, even though it was getting late. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. I called out to them, but there was no answer. I walked to the edge of the woods and shouted for them again, but all I heard was the rustling of leaves in the wind. Panic began to set in. I grabbed a flashlight and started running down the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. The woods were darker than I remembered, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. When I reached the clearing, the treehouse was empty. The rope ladder swayed gently in the breeze, but there was no sign of the boys. I called their names, my voice breaking with fear, but there was no response. The silence was deafening. I climbed up to the treehouse, hoping they were hiding inside, playing a game, but it was empty. The only thing I found was one of Oliver's toes, a small action figure lying in the corner, forgotten. As I climbed back down, I noticed something strange at the base of the tree, a patch of earth that looked freshly disturbed, as if someone had been digging there recently. The ground was loose, and as I knelt down to inspect it, I felt a cold breeze brush past me, carrying with it a faint whisper. I froze, straining to hear, but the whispering faded as quickly as it had come. I was about to start digging when I heard the boys' voices coming from the trail. They were running towards me, out of breath and laughing, as if nothing was wrong. Relief flooded through me, but it was quickly replaced by anger and confusion. I demanded to know where they had been, why they hadn't answered when I called, but they just looked at me blankly, as if they didn't understand what I was talking about. They insisted they had been in the treehouse the whole time, playing quietly. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of it. The boys seemed fine, completely unaware of how scared I had been, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I decided to do some research to find out more about the woods and the town's history. What I found made my blood run cold. Years ago, there had been a series of disappearances in Ashford, all children, all around the same age as Michael and Oliver. They had vanished without a trace, their bodies never found. The townspeople had searched the woods for weeks, but nothing was ever discovered. The disappearances had stopped as suddenly as they had started, and the town had moved on, burying the tragedy in whispers and superstition. But there was one story that stood out, a local legend about the Whispering Woods. According to the tale, the woods were home to an ancient spirit, a guardian of sorts, who would lure children into the forest with promises of adventure and fun. The spirit would take the children and keep them, trapping their souls in the woods forever. The tree house, I realized with growing horror, must have been its lure. I knew then that I had to keep the boys away from the tree house at all costs. I told my husband everything, showed him the stories I had found, and together we agreed that the boys were never to go back to the woods. We told them it wasn't safe, that the tree house was too old and could collapse at any moment. They were disappointed, of course, but they seemed to understand. For a while, things were normal again. The boys played in the yard, rode their bikes around the neighborhood, and life in Ashford resumed its quiet, peaceful rhythm. But the unease never fully left me. I kept a close eye on the boys, never letting them out of my sight for too long. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, waiting for its chance. Then, one evening, just as the sun was setting, I heard it again, the whispering. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustling of the leaves, but it was there, calling from the woods. I ran to the boys' room and found it empty. Panic gripped me as I tore through the house, searching for them. I found them at the edge of the yard, standing at the entrance to the trail, staring into the darkening woods. They were in a trance, their eyes glazed over as they murmured in unison, their voices blending with the whispers. I screamed their names, but they didn't respond. I grabbed them by the shoulders, shaking them, and they blinked, snapping out of whatever spell they were under. They looked at me, confused and frightened, as if they didn't know how they had gotten there. That night, I made the decision to leave Ashford. We packed up our things and left the next morning, leaving behind the house, the woods, and the tree house. We moved back to the city, to a place far from forest and old legends. The boys don't remember much about our time in Ashford. They've forgotten the treehouse, the woods, and the whispering. But I haven't. I still hear the whispers sometimes in the quiet moments when the wind rustles through the trees, and I wonder if we truly escaped. I wonder if the spirit is still out there, waiting for the next family to move into the little cottage on the edge of the woods, waiting to lure their children into the whispering woods, never to return. The road to Cold Creek is a lonely one, stretching for miles through dense forests and barren fields, with nothing but the occasional farmhouse to break the monotony. I had been on the road for hours, the hum of the engine the only sound in the stillness of the night. It was the kind of night where the darkness seemed to press in from all sides, swallowing up the world beyond the reach of my headlights. I was on my way to visit an old friend, someone I hadn't seen in years, and the isolation of the journey was beginning to wear on me. The road was empty, not a single car in sight, which wasn't surprising given the remoteness of the area. Cold Creek was the kind of town people forgot about, a small dot on the map that had seen better days. As I drove, the trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands, casting long shadows across the road. The only sign of life was the occasional flicker of a deer's eyes caught in the beams of my headlights, quickly disappearing back into the underbrush. The first sign that something was wrong came when I noticed the fog. It rolled in without warning, thick and heavy, clinging to the ground like a living thing. It was unlike any fog I had ever seen before, dense and almost opaque. making it difficult to see more than a few feet in front of me. I slowed the car to a crawl, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel, my eyes straining to make out the road ahead. As the fog grew thicker, a sense of unease settled over me, like an itch I couldn't scratch. The road, once so familiar, seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense, as if it were leading me somewhere I didn't want to go. I felt a chill run down my spine, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, so deep it seemed to vibrate through the car, rattling the windows. It came from somewhere in the fog, a sound that was both distant and impossibly close at the same time. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I strained to hear it again. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of something moving through the trees. It was the sound of something large, something powerful, and it was getting closer. My first instinct was to hit the gas, to get as far away from that sound as possible. But before I could react, something slammed into the side of the car with a force that sent me skidding off the road. The world tilted as the car spun out of control, the tires screeching against the pavement before finally coming to a stop in a ditch. For a moment, I sat there in stunned silence, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I turned off the engine, the sudden silence almost deafening after the chaos of the crash. The fog had thickened, the world outside the car a swirling mass of white. I could barely see the trees lining the road, their twisted branches looming like shadows in the mist. And then I heard it again, the growl, low and menacing, followed by the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. I fumbled with the door handle, my hands shaking as I forced it open. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, the fog swirling around me as I stepped out of the car. My breath came in ragged gasps, the fog condensing into droplets that clung to my skin and clothes. I could feel eyes on me, watching from the darkness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the thick wall of fog. I knew I had to move, had to get out of there before whatever was out there found me. I started to run, my feet slipping on the wet ground as I scrambled up the embankment and back onto the road. The fog was so thick I could barely see a few feet in front of me, the world reduced to shadows and shapes that seemed to shift and change as I moved. The growl came again, closer this time, and I could hear the sound of heavy footsteps behind me, the ground shaking with each step. Whatever it was massive, and it was fast. I could hear it breathing, a deep, guttural sound that sent a wave of terror through me. I ran faster, my lungs burning, my heart pounding in my chest as I fought to stay ahead of the creature that was chasing me. But no matter how fast I ran, the footsteps kept getting closer, the growl growing louder and more aggressive. I could feel the creature's hot breath on the back of my neck, the stench of decay filling the air. I knew I couldn't outrun it, knew that it was only a matter of time before it caught up to me. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something in the fog, a shape dark and indistinct, but unmistakably human. I veered towards it, desperate for any kind of help, my legs burning as I pushed myself to move faster. The shape moved towards me, a figure emerging from the fog, and for a brief moment I felt a surge of hope. But as the figure came into view, my hope turned to horror. It was a man, or at least, it had once been a man. His skin was pale and mottled, his eyes wide and vacant, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream. He was covered in blood, his clothes torn and tattered, and he was holding something in his hands, a large, twisted branch. Covered in sharp thorns, he raised the branch above his head, his mouth opening wider as he let out a low, mournful wail. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a root as I fell to the ground. The man, or whatever he was, lunged at me, the branch coming down towards my head. I rolled to the side, the branch slamming into the ground. Where I had just been, the thorns tearing into the earth. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my ears as I backed away from the man. He stood there for a moment, his chest heaving as he stared at me with those vacant, lifeless eyes. And then, without warning, he turned and ran, disappearing into the fog as quickly as he had appeared. I didn't wait to see where he went. I turned and ran, my legs feeling like lead as I pushed myself to keep moving. The growl was still there, the footsteps still following me, but the creature never showed itself. It stayed just out of sight, a shadow in the fog, always on the edge of my vision. Finally, after what felt like hours of running, I saw a light in the distance. It was faint, barely visible through the fog, but it was enough to give me hope. I ran towards it, my legs shaking, my lungs burning, the light growing brighter with each step. When I finally reached it, I found myself standing in front of an old, weathered cabin, the light coming from a lantern hanging by the door. The cabin looked abandoned, the windows dark and empty. But I didn't care. I pounded on the door, my fists aching as I shouted for help. The door creaked open, and an old man stood there, his eyes narrowing as he looked me up and down. He was tall and thin, with a long white beard and a weathered face that spoke of a life lived in isolation. He didn't say a word, just stepped aside and motioned for me to come in. I stumbled into the cabin, my legs barely holding me up as I collapsed onto a worn-out chair. The old man closed the door behind me, the sound of the latch echoing through the small, dimly lit room. He didn't ask what had happened, didn't offer me any comfort. He just stared at me with those cold, calculating eyes, as if he were sizing me up, deciding whether or not I was worth saving. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. His voice was low and rough, like gravel scraping against metal. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked, his eyes boring into mine. I nodded, unable to speak, my throat dry and raw from running. The old man grunted as if he had expected as much. He walked over to the window, peering out into the fog, his expression unreadable. "You're lucky you made it this far," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Most don't." I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. I just sat there, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The old man turned back to me, his eyes hard and unforgiving. "There's something out there," he said, his voice low and serious. "Something that's been here long before we ever came. It doesn't like intruders." I shuddered, the memory of the growl, the footsteps, and the man with the branch flooding back. The old man sighed, as if he had seen this all before, as if he knew exactly what I was going through. "You'll stay here tonight," he said, more of a command than an offer. "In the morning you'll leave, and you'll never come back." I didn't argue. I didn't want to spend another second in that fog, didn't want to know what else might be out there, waiting in the darkness. The old man led me to a small, dusty bed in the corner of the cabin, and I collapsed onto it, too exhausted to care about the state of the room. As I lay there, staring up at the cracked ceiling, I could still hear the growl, still feel the eyes watching me from the darkness. But the cabin was warm, and the old man seemed to know what he was doing. For the first time that night, I felt a small measure of safety, but as I drifted off to sleep, one thought kept running through my mind, a question that I knew I would never get an answer to. What was out there in the fog, and why had it let me go? When my father passed away, he left me a small, weathered journal, its pages filled with neat handwriting and the occasional sketch. I hadn't even known he kept a journal, so it was a surprise to find it among his belongings. The journal detailed his time as a lighthouse keeper on a remote stretch of the coast, a job he had taken before I was born, long before he met my mother. I knew he had worked at a lighthouse, but he had never talked about it much, always brushing off my questions with a vague smile and a change of subject. As I started reading, I understood why the journal began with mundane entries about the weather, the maintenance of the light, and the isolation he felt being so far from civilization. The lighthouse, called Blackstone Point, was perched on a rocky cliff, surrounded by the churning sea on 3 sides. It was a lonely place, with the nearest town being a day's journey away. My father was the only keeper tasked with ensuring that the light stayed on every night to guide ships safely past the treacherous coastline. But as I read further, the entries grew darker, more erratic. He wrote about strange noises at night, whispers carried on the wind that seemed to come from the ocean itself. He described how the light would flicker for no reason, even though all the equipment was in perfect working order. He started having vivid nightmares, dreams of drowning, of being pulled into the sea by unseen hands. The sketches in the journal became more unsettling as well-crude drawings of twisted figures and monstrous shapes rising from the water. One entry, dated 6 months into his tenure, Blackstone Point, stood out. It was hastily scrawled, the handwriting jagged and frantic. "Something is wrong here. I can feel it in my bones. The light flickers more often now, and I swear I saw something in the water last night, a figure, pale and thin, standing on the rocks below the lighthouse. It disappeared when I shone the light on it, but I know what I saw. I'm not alone here." The entries after that were brief, almost incoherent. He wrote about hearing footsteps on the stairs when he was alone in the lighthouse, the feeling of being watched, and the overwhelming dread that had settled over him. The final entry was dated to weeks before he left the lighthouse for good. It was a single sentence. "They are calling me." There was no explanation, no further details, just those 3 words. After that, the journal was empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened to my father at Blackstone Point, something he had never told anyone about. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to visit the lighthouse. I wanted to see the place for myself, to understand what had driven my father to the brink of madness. The journey to Blackstone Point was long and arduous. The town nearest to the lighthouse had fallen into disrepair, with most of the buildings abandoned and the roads overgrown with weeds. The locals were wary, giving me strange looks when I asked for directions. An old man at the only remaining pub in town finally gave me the information I needed, though he warned me against going there. "That place is cursed," he said, his voice low and serious. "Bad things happen to those who go poking around where they don't belong. Your father was lucky to leave when he did. I thank him for the warning, but it only strengthened my resolve. I had to know the truth. The path to the lighthouse was steep and treacherous, winding through dense forest before emerging onto the rocky cliffs. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and decay, the sound of crashing waves echoing in the distance. When I finally reached the lighthouse, it was exactly as my father had described, tall and imposing, with its weathered white walls and the rusted metal railing that encircled the light at the top. The door creaked ominously as I pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of mildew. Dust covered every surface, and the only light came from the small windows that lined the tower's spiral staircase. As I climbed the stairs, the feeling of unease grew stronger with each step. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched, that something was lurking in the shadows just out of sight. At the top of the lighthouse, the light itself was still intact, though it hadn't been lit in years. I walked around the narrow platform, looking out at the endless expanse of ocean that stretched to the horizon. The view was breathtaking, but it did little to calm my nerves. I pulled out my father's journal and reread the final entry, feeling a chill run down my spine. They are calling me. What had he meant by that? Who or what was calling him? I leaned against the railing, lost in thought, when I heard it the faintest whisper, carried on the wind. I froze, my heart racing. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, but I couldn't make out the words. It seemed to be coming from the ocean, from the waves crashing against the rocks below. I looked down and saw a figure standing on the rocks, just as my father had described. It was pale and thin, its long hair tangled and wet, its eyes dark and hollow. It was watching me, its lips moving as it whispered my name. I stumbled back, nearly falling as I scrambled to get away from the edge. The figure didn't move, just continued to stare up at me with those empty eyes. Panic set in, and I bolted down the stairs, my footsteps echoing off the stone walls. I had to get out of there, to get as far away from that place as possible. But as I reached the bottom of the tower, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. I was trapped. The whispers grew louder, filling the small space with their eerie chant. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block them out, but they only grew louder, more insistent. They are calling me. I screamed, backing away from the door, only to stumble over something on the floor. I looked down and saw it another journal, much older than my father's, its pages yellowed with age. I picked it up with trembling hands and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words were clear. I am the keeper of Blackstone Point. They are calling me, and I must answer. The journal was filled with similar entries, all from different people, all lighthouse keepers who had worked at Blackstone Point over the years. Each one described the same things: whispers in the night, figures in the water, and the overwhelming urge to answer the call. The final entry in each journal was the same. They are calling me. I realized then what had happened to my father, to all the keepers before him. The lighthouse was cursed, haunted by something ancient and malevolent that drew people to it, driving them mad until they finally gave in and answered the call. My father had escaped, but the others had not been so lucky. The door suddenly burst open, and I was thrown to the ground by a powerful gust of wind. The whispers filled the room, deafening now, as if the very walls were speaking to me. I crawled to the door, desperate to escape, but the wind was too strong, pushing me back inside. They are calling me. The figure appeared in the doorway, its dark eyes locked on mine. It reached out a hand, beckoning me to come closer. I felt an overwhelming urge to comply, to walk into the ocean and disappear beneath the waves. But I fought against it, summoning every ounce of strength I had left. I couldn't let the same fate befall me. With one final burst of energy, I pushed myself to my feet and ran for the door. The wind howled around me, the whispers screaming in my ears, but I kept going, forcing myself to move forward. I burst out of the lighthouse and into the daylight. The whispers suddenly silenced as I crossed the threshold. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the forest. I turned back to look at the lighthouse, standing tall and silent against the backdrop of the sea. The figure was gone, the whispers faded, but I knew they were still there, waiting for the next keeper to answer the call. I never returned to Blackstone Point. I couldn't. The lighthouse was abandoned, left to decay on the cliffs, a warning to anyone who might be tempted to take up the mantle of keeper. My father's journal sits on my shelf, a reminder of the horrors that lurk in the most unexpected places. I often think about those words, the ones that haunted my father and all the keepers before him. They are calling me, and I wonder if one day I'll hear them too.